My parents left a wrapped box on my doorstep with one warning: do not make a scene. Sign the papers inside, and we will post your bail. Then they drove off in their Bentley. I opened it and nearly dropped to my knees. Trembling not out of fear, but pure rage, I dialed 911. Minutes later, my husband stepped inside, saw two officers in our home, and turned pale. "Please do not tell me they actually did it," he said. "I am Naomi, 32 years old, and a senior forensic auditor for a top federal contractor in Atlanta. I have spent my entire life as the scapegoat of the Sterling family, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn down a toxic family dynamic to protect your own peace." It was a pristine Tuesday morning in our quiet Buckhead neighborhood. The southern heat had not quite settled in yet, and the upscale streets were still waking up. I was standing in my impeccably designed living room, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee and preparing for a major audit presentation. My husband Marcus had left early to check on a new commercial site for his architectural firm. The house was peaceful until my phone buzzed with a notification from our front porch security camera. I glanced at the screen and saw my parents' recognizable silver Bentley pull up to the curb. My mother Vivian and my father DeAndre stepped out. They were dressed in their usual Atlanta high society uniform, looking like they were heading to an exclusive country club brunch rather than committing a federal crime. My father walked up our stone pathway carrying a large, elegantly wrapped gift box. He placed it carefully on the welcome mat, turned around, and walked right back to the car without knocking. A second later, my phone chimed with a text message from my mother. It read simply, "Do not make a scene, Naomi. Sign the papers inside and we will post your bail. Just remember, the Sterling legacy is bigger than any of us." My brow furrowed. I unlocked the front door and pulled the heavy box inside, setting it down on my glass coffee table. It was wrapped in thick silver paper with a silk ribbon. I tore the paper away and pulled off the cardboard lid. What I found inside made the breath completely leave my lungs. Sitting on top was a dark blue passport. I picked it up and flipped it open. It had my face on it, but a completely different name and a stamp showing recent entry into the Cayman Islands. This was a place I had never visited in my life. Beneath the passport lay a cheap prepaid burner phone still sealed in its plastic packaging. But the real nightmare was at the very bottom of the box. It was a thick stack of offshore banking documents and wire transfer logs. I am a forensic auditor. I track illicit money for a living. It took me less than 2 minutes of scanning those pages to understand exactly what I was looking at. The documents showed a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts, all illegally funneling money out of Vanguard Horizon. That was the elite hedge fund managed by my arrogant white brother-in-law, Bryce Davenport. Bryce was married to my older sister Chloe, who was the undisputed golden child of the Sterling family. He had always paraded my family around as his personal diversity optics, while treating Marcus and me with barely concealed disdain. Now, looking at these papers, the reality hit me with the force of a freight train. Bryce had embezzled $8 million from his own investors, and my parents, my own flesh and blood, had actively helped him forge documents to frame me as the mastermind behind the entire operation. They wanted me to take the fall and go to federal prison so their perfect golden daughter and her wealthy husband could maintain their lavish lifestyle. I did not cry. I did not panic. A deep, cold rage settled into my bones. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my real phone, and dialed 911. I asked for the Financial Crimes Division, stating clearly that I was a federal contractor reporting a massive identity theft and framing attempt. 20 minutes later, 2 local police officers were standing in my living room, bagging the fake passport and the burner phone as evidence. Just as I was handing over the wire transfer logs, the front door opened and Marcus walked in. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the officers and then at the scattered documents on the glass table. His eyes met mine and the color drained from his face. "Naomi, please do not tell me they actually did it," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Yes," I replied, crossing my arms. "They dropped it off 30 minutes ago. Vivian and DeAndre actually tried to set me up for Bryce and his $8 million embezzlement scheme. Marcus ran a hand over his face, shaking his head in disgust. He knew exactly how toxic my family was. He knew they had always sacrificed my well-being to protect Chloe, but trying to send me to federal prison was an entirely new level of depravity, even for them. I turned to the older officer who was sealing the fake passport in an evidence bag. Officer, I want to file a formal report for federal identity theft and conspiracy. The prime suspects just drove away from this house in a silver Bentley. I have their faces on my security footage, and I have the digital paper trail to prove these offshore accounts were opened using forged credentials. The officer nodded, taking detailed notes. We will secure this evidence and forward the report to the federal authorities, ma'am. Since you are an auditor with federal clearance, they will likely fast-track this investigation. I thanked them and walked them to the door. As soon as the police cruiser pulled out of our driveway, the heavy silence of the house returned. Marcus walked over and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a tight embrace. I rested my head against his chest, letting his steady heartbeat ground me. We had known Bryce was involved in shady dealings, but we never thought my parents would willingly offer me up as the sacrificial lamb to save him. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp ringing of my cell phone on the kitchen counter. I pulled away from Marcus and walked over to look at the screen. It was Bryce. I answered the call and put it on speakerphone, making sure Marcus could hear every word. Well, Naomi, Bryce said, his voice dripping with that familiar condescending arrogance. I see you opened your gift. I really hope you are being smart about this. I just had a very interesting chat with the local police, Bryce, I said, keeping my tone dangerously calm. Bryce let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Cops will not save you, Naomi. You do not understand high finance. Local badges cannot protect you from the FBI. We made sure the digital footprints point directly to your home office. We are pulling into your driveway right now. Have your pen ready to sign that confession because you are out of options. I looked at Marcus, who was staring at the front door with a cold, deadly focus. I smiled into the phone. Come on in, Bryce. The door is unlocked. The heavy oak door swung open before anyone knocked. My mother, Vivian, marched into my foyer like a general inspecting conquered territory. She wore a pristine white suit that sharply contrasted with her deep scowl. Right behind her was my father, DeAndre, puffing his chest out in a custom blazer. Next came my older sister, Chloe, clinging dramatically to her husband, Bryce. Bryce walked in last, wiping his expensive loafers on my rug with a deliberate scrape. He looked around with absolute entitlement. Vivian did not waste a single second. She stopped, crossed her arms, and glared at me. Naomi, look at you. She sighed. Your hair is completely unstyled. I told you 100 times that natural look does not suit your face shape. And this house, she waved a manicured hand at my curated space. You would think a woman your age would have upgraded from this cramped starter home by now. Look at Chloe. She manages a massive penthouse and still finds time to look presentable for her family. I stood perfectly still. For 32 years, she had never missed an opportunity to tear me down. My clothes, my career choices, everything was always a failure compared to her golden child, Chloe. Chloe offered a pathetic pout, rubbing her flat stomach as if she were a fragile victim. Bryce let go of Chloe and stepped forward, ignoring Marcus, who was standing silently by the kitchen island. Bryce dropped a thick legal document next to the torn silver box. Let us skip the pleasantries, Naomi, Bryce said. His voice was smooth and dripping with absolute arrogance. I know you are upset about the box, but this is bigger than you. He tapped the document. This is a full confession. It states that you used your financial access to independently set up those offshore accounts. It says you moved the $8 million to the Cayman Islands on your own. You want me to sign a confession for a federal crime I did not commit so you can walk away free? I asked. Bryce chuckled, shaking his head. You do not understand high finance, Naomi. If I go down, the entire firm goes down. Hundreds of millions vanish. My reputation in Atlanta is ruined. And more importantly, the Sterling and Davenport legacy is tarnished. We cannot have a scandal like this attached to my name. And why should your name be protected while mine gets dragged through federal court? I asked. My mother stepped forward, her eyes flashing. Because Chloe is pregnant, Naomi. Vivian shouted the words like a royal decree. Your sister is carrying the first Davenport heir. She needs a stable home and her husband. You have nothing to lose. You have no children. You sit at a computer all day typing numbers for some government contract. If you go to prison for a few years, it is a minor setback. When you get out, we will give you $200,000 to start over. It is the least you can do. I looked at my mother feeling absolute clarity. She was standing in my home demanding I sacrifice my freedom and future just so her favorite daughter would not face the embarrassment of a criminal husband. Are you really pregnant, Chloe? I asked flatly. Or is this just another lie Bryce invented to manipulate them? Chloe gasped, clutching her chest. How dare you, Naomi? I am 12 weeks along and highly stressed. The doctor said I need complete peace. You have always been so incredibly selfish. Bryce smiled, placing a hand on Chloe's shoulder. See, Naomi, this is about protecting the family. You are the only one who can take this hit. The documents are already in your name. If you fight this, the authorities will drag us through a public trial, and we will paint you as a bitter, jealous sister who stole the money out of spite. Sign the paper. We will post your bail this afternoon. It will be painless. I looked down at the confession contract. The crisp pages seemed to glow against the coffee table. I picked up a silver pen resting nearby. My mother let out a loud sigh of relief. Bryce smirked, crossing his arms. Chloe gave a dramatic little sniffle. I held the pen over the signature line. Then I looked Bryce dead in the eyes and dropped the pen onto the floor. It clattered loudly against the hardwood. I am not signing anything, I said. And I am definitely not taking the fall for a mediocre white man who steals from his clients because he is terrible at his job. The room erupted. Vivian shrieked in absolute horror. Bryce turned purple, his smug mask instantly dissolving into pure rage. But it was my father DeAndre who stepped up. He pushed past Vivian, his large frame looming over the table, his face twisted into a scowl of pure authoritarian fury. You listen to me right now, you ungrateful little brat! DeAndre growled, his voice booming. You are going to pick up that pen and sign your name. Do you think you have a choice here? Do you really think you can defy this family after everything we have given you? I stared right back at him. You have given me nothing but grief, Dad. DeAndre let out a loud, booming laugh. Nothing. I gave you this house, Naomi. Did you forget that? When you and your pet architect wanted to buy this place, you did not have the credit. I co-signed your mortgage. My name is on the paperwork for the very roof over your head. He leaned in close, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. If you do not sign that confession right now, I am calling the bank. I will pull my name off the loan and foreclose on this house today. I will have you and Marcus thrown out on the street before sunset. Sign it now. I turned my back on my father. The room was practically vibrating with his rage, but I felt nothing but a deep, settling calm. I walked over to the kitchen island. The white marble was cool under my fingertips. I picked up a heavy crystal pitcher and poured myself a glass of iced water. The ice cubes clinked softly against the glass. It was the only sound in the house for several long seconds. I lifted the glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. DeAndre mistook my silence for submission. He puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of his custom blazer. He began pacing across my living room rug, acting like a high-profile prosecutor, delivering a closing argument to a captive jury. He loved the sound of his own voice. He told me he always knew I would be a flight risk one day. He said he structured the original mortgage loan specifically for a moment exactly like this. He reminded me of how generous he was 7 years ago. When Marcus and I were newly married and struggling to secure a traditional loan because of my student debt, DeAndre had swooped in to play the savior. He co-signed the mortgage, but he made sure to set it up through one of his private corporate entities. He held 80% of the equity. He gloated about a rapid call clause he had his lawyers buried deep in the fine print. He smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and announced that all it takes is one single phone call to his private banker. The loan goes into immediate default and the bank seizes the property. He wanted to make sure I never outgrew my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. Chloe could not resist the opportunity to kick me while she thought I was down. She released Bryce's arm and strutted over to my glass dining table. She ran her hand along the edge, leaving a smudge on purpose. She scoffed at the square footage of my home, looking around with exaggerated pity. She reminded everyone that her penthouse in Buckhead had floor-to-ceiling windows and panoramic views of the city. She bragged that Bryce bought it for her entirely in cash, so she never had to worry about a bank. Then she turned her sights on me. She called me a broke failure. She said I had spent my entire life trying to act superior with my government job and my moral high ground, only to end up begging Daddy to keep a roof over my head. She told me I was pathetic. She said I should be grateful they even allowed me to attend holiday dinners. She crossed her arms and demanded I sign the confession paper so she could go home and rest her pregnant feet. I watched my sister perform her routine. The delusion was almost tragic. I set my water glass down. The condensation left a perfect little ring on the dark counter. I reached down and pulled open the top drawer of the kitchen island. I took out a thick manila folder and tossed it onto the marble. It slid smoothly across the surface, stopping right in front of DeAndre. "Read it," I said. DeAndre glared at me, but he snatched the folder off the counter. He flipped it open. His eyes scanned the top page. I watched the arrogant flush completely drain from his cheeks. His mouth fell open slightly. I explained exactly what he was looking at. I reminded him that I am a senior forensic auditor. I track hidden assets and read fine print for a living. I saw the trap he laid the very day he handed me that original contract 7 years ago. I knew he wanted to keep me on a financial leash forever. So I smiled, I signed it, and I waited. I told him that 3 years ago, Marcus secured a massive development contract with the city of Atlanta. His architectural firm pulled in record-breaking profits that quarter. The very first thing we did with that corporate money was refinance this house. DeAndre stared at the papers, breathing heavily. I detailed how I wired his initial investment back to him. I routed it through an anonymous holding company so he would never see my name attached to the transfer. I told him he probably thought it was a random dividend payout. I pointed at the document in his trembling hands. "The mortgage is entirely in my name and Marcus' name. The house is completely paid off." I looked at my father with absolute disgust. "You have no legal right to this property. You cannot foreclose on anything because you have not been on the deed for 36 months. You have absolutely zero leverage over me." Vivian gasped. She snatched the paperwork out of DeAndre's hands and read it for herself. Her face turned a sickly shade of gray. The ultimate weapon they thought they held over my head was completely useless. They had marched into my home expecting an easy surrender, and instead, they were holding a certified document proving their power over me was a ghost. DeAndre crumpled the edge of the folder in his large fist. He was completely speechless, unable to form a single coherent threat. He had lost his ultimate trump card. Bryce saw the great patriarch crumbling. He realized the house threat was dead. Bryce stepped forward, adjusting his expensive designer watch to buy a second of time. His smug mask slipped back into place. He looked past me and locked eyes with Marcus, who had been standing quietly taking in the entire scene. Bryce smiled, a thin, venomous smile. He decided to attack the only other thing in the world I cared about. Bryce told me that I might have saved my little house, but I could not protect everything. He turned his full arrogant attention to my husband. Bryce said he knew exactly where Marcus leased his new architectural headquarters downtown. He named the prestigious commercial building right in the middle of the arts district. Bryce proudly announced that his hedge fund, Vanguard Horizon, had quietly acquired that entire block last month. He held the master lease. Bryce took a step closer, pointing a threatening finger directly at Marcus. He stated clearly that if I did not sign the confession, taking the fall for the $8 million, he would terminate that commercial lease tomorrow morning. He promised to lock Marcus out of his own firm, seize all of his expensive drafting equipment, and completely destroy his architectural business before lunchtime. The room fell dead silent after Bryce delivered his threat. He stood there with his chest puffed out, an arrogant smirk pasted across his perfectly moisturized face. He truly believed he had just delivered the killing blow. Chloe leaned her head against his shoulder, looking at me with a sickening mixture of pity and triumph. My parents exhaled in unison, clearly relieved that their wealthy white son-in-law had stepped up to handle the mess they created. But they had entirely forgotten about the man leaning quietly against the marble kitchen island. Marcus pushed himself off the counter. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, rolling his shoulders back and adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. He did not look angry. He looked like a wolf who had just been invited into a sheep pen. Bryce let out a short, mocking laugh as Marcus approached. "What are you going to do, Marcus?" Bryce sneered. "Are you going to draw me a nasty blueprint? You need to sit down and let the adults handle this. You play with Lincoln Logs for a living. I move global markets. You are out of your depth." My mother, Vivian, immediately seized the opportunity to pile on. She had been waiting for this moment since the day I introduced Marcus to the family. She stepped forward, shaking her head with an expression of profound disgust. "This is exactly what I warned you about." "Naomi," Vivian said, her voice dripping with venom. "This is what happens when you marry a man with calluses on his hands instead of a trust fund. Your father was a mechanic, Marcus. Bryce comes from generational wealth. His family sits on the board of the Federal Reserve. Did you honestly think your little blue-collar hustle could protect my daughter from real power? You do not have the capital, the pedigree, or the intellect to fight us. You are a glorified contractor." DeAndre nodded in agreement, crossing his arms. "We warned you, Naomi. We told you to marry within our circle. Now look at you. Your husband cannot even protect his own office lease." Marcus stopped a few feet away from Bryce. A low, rumbling laugh started in the back of his throat. It was not a nervous laugh. It was a rich, genuinely amused chuckle that echoed off the high ceilings of our living room. Bryce frowned, his smug smile faltering just a fraction. "Generational wealth," Marcus repeated, letting the words roll around in his mouth like a bad taste. "High finance. That is a fascinating way to describe stealing from pensioners, Bryce." Marcus turned his back on my furious family and walked over to his leather briefcase resting on the dining table. He unclasped the brass buckles and pulled out his silver laptop. With a few quick keystrokes, he connected it to our living room smart television. The massive 75-inch screen flickered to life. "You see, Bryce," Marcus said, his voice deadly calm. "The problem with arrogant men who inherit everything is that they never actually learn how to read a room. And they certainly never learn how to read a commercial real estate contract." A document appeared on the television screen. It was a property deed, heavily redacted, but with a few key highlighted sections. Bryce squinted at the screen. "What is this garbage?" he demanded. "This garbage is the master deed for the commercial block located at 400 West Peachtree Street," Marcus explained casually, leaning against the wall. "That happens to be the exact address of your hedge fund, Vanguard Horizon, and the exact address of my architectural firm. You mentioned earlier that your fund holds the master lease for that building." "I do hold the master lease," Bryce snapped, his face flushing red. "I hold it through a subsidiary holding company. I control the whole block." Marcus tapped a button on his keyboard. A new document flashed onto the screen displaying the corporate registration for that exact holding company. The sole managing director listed at the very bottom was Marcus Pierce. "You hold a sublease," Bryce, Marcus corrected softly. "You have been leasing your entire corporate headquarters from an anonymous holding company for the past 14 months. I own that holding company. I bought that building outright last year using the profits you all just called a blue-collar hustle. I do not just own my office, Bryce. I own your office too. Every single month for the last year, you have been wiring your rent money directly into my bank account." The color completely drained from Bryce's face. He took a physical step backwards, staring at the television screen in absolute horror. Chloe dropped her hand from his arm, her mouth hanging open. But Marcus was not finished. He tapped another key. The screen shifted again, bringing up a formal legal decree stamped with the official seal of the city of Atlanta. "And it gets better." Marcus continued, his voice cutting through the silent room like a razor blade. "Since I am the actual landlord of that property, I was required to comply with a recent city zoning audit. Do you want to guess what the city inspectors found squirming around in the basement of your hedge fund, Bryce? They found massive zoning violations, illegal server racks, and unregistered offshore communication hubs. DeAndre stepped forward, his eyes wide with panic. What does that mean? He asked, his voice trembling. It means the city of Atlanta just invalidated Vanguard Horizon entire operating license, Marcus said, staring directly at my father. They are evicting Bryce. And because the city wants to revitalize that district, they just awarded an exclusive $80 million redevelopment contract to the architectural firm that brought the violations to light. My firm. We are bulldozing your hedge fund next month, Bryce. I am going to turn your illegal empire into a public park. Bryce stood frozen, unable to formulate a single word. His breathing was shallow and ragged. The illusion of his absolute power had been shattered in less than 3 minutes. The generational wealth he bragged about was nothing but a fragile house of cards, and my husband had just lit the match. Vivian realized everything was falling apart. The white knight she had banked her entire social standing on was a fraud. Panic seized her features. She looked at the torn silver box on the table, then at the federal evidence scattered across the glass. She lunged forward and grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. "Naomi, you have to fix this!" Vivian screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "The Sterling Annual Charity Gala is tonight. Half of the city elite will be there. The mayor will be there. You are going to put on a gown. You are coming to that gala, and you will confess to the board that this was all a misunderstanding. You will take the blame for the offshore accounts. If you do not walk into that ballroom tonight and save this family, you are no longer my daughter." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I just stared at her until she slowly loosened her grip and stepped back, intimidated by the coldness in my eyes. "Oh, I will be at the gala, Mother," I said, offering her a bright, terrifying smile. "But I am not bringing a confession." The heavy front door clicked shut behind them, sealing the chaotic panic of my family outside. I stood in the center of the living room, listening to the frantic revving of Bryce starting his car engine. The tires screeched against the asphalt as they sped away from our curb. They were running on borrowed time, and they knew it. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the pristine silence of my home wash over me. The time for playing the obedient scapegoat was officially over. I turned on my heel and walked toward the grand staircase. It was time to get ready for a slaughter. I walked into my master suite and went straight for the custom walk-in closet. I bypassed the conservative blazers and modest dresses my mother always preferred to see me wear. Instead, I reached for a garment bag tucked all the way in the back. I unzipped it, revealing a custom-tailored emerald green evening gown. It was constructed from heavy imported silk, with a razor-sharp, plunging neckline and a dangerously high slit. It was not a dress designed to blend into the background. It was a dress built for war. I slipped it on, feeling the cold, smooth fabric mold perfectly against my skin like custom armor. As I sat down at my vanity to apply my makeup, I looked directly into the mirror, locking eyes with my own reflection. I needed you to understand exactly how deep this betrayal runs. What my family tried to do to me this morning, dropping that box of federal crimes on my porch, was not a sudden act of desperation. It was simply the grand finale of a lifetime of theft. When I was 18 years old, I received an acceptance letter to my dream college. My grandfather had left a substantial trust fund, specifically designated for my university tuition. I was supposed to graduate completely debt-free. But 2 weeks before my freshman semester began, my debit card was declined at a campus bookstore. I called the bank and discovered the entire account had been drained to zero. Every single cent was gone. Vivian and DeAndre had forged my signature and completely emptied my educational trust. They took my future and handed it directly to Chloe. She wanted to launch a luxury lifestyle brand selling overpriced scented candles and cheap imported silk robes. They called it Maison Davenport. They threw a massive launch party with champagne towers and celebrity guests, all paid for with my tuition money. Chloe bankrupted the entire company in less than 2 years because she refused to actually work. While my sister was taking trips to Paris to find inspiration, I was working night shifts at a diner. I ate ramen noodles for dinner and took out crushing predatory student loans just to pay for my accounting textbooks. When I confronted my parents, they called me selfish. They told me Chloe needed the financial support to establish her brand and that I was smart enough to figure it out on my own. They were right about one thing. I did figure it out. I graduated at the top of my class. I spent the next decade mastering the architecture of hidden wealth. My family thought I was just a basic pencil pusher doing taxes for middle management. Bryce thought he was so much smarter than the quiet black sister-in-law who sat in the corner at family dinners. He thought I simply did not understand high finance. He had absolutely no idea that I am a senior forensic auditor. He did not know that for the past 6 months I have been quietly contracted by the Securities and Exchange Commission to track phantom money flooding through the Atlanta commercial real estate market. Vanguard Horizon was my primary target. I stood up from the vanity and walked over to a large, modern abstract painting hanging on the far wall of my bedroom. I reached behind the heavy canvas and pressed a hidden latch. The painting swung open silently, revealing a biometric wall safe. I placed my thumb against the scanner. A green light flashed and the heavy steel door clicked open. Inside the safe sat 3 sleek black encrypted flash drives. I reached in and pulled them out, weighing them in the palm of my hand. These drives contained the absolute destruction of Bryce Davenport. They held every deleted wire transfer, every hidden offshore account ledger, and every desperate email he sent trying to cover his tracks. I walked over to my nightstand and picked up my secure phone. I dialed a direct encrypted line. It rang only twice before a voice answered. "Agent Miller here," the voice said. "The target is fully panicked," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Bryce Davenport just left my property. He tried to force me to sign a fabricated confession. He is going to try to move the remaining offshore assets tonight before the bank regulators catch on." "Understood, Naomi," Agent Miller replied. "We have our financial cyber teams monitoring the Cayman routing numbers right now. The moment he attempts to initiate a transfer, the system will flag it and freeze the entire portfolio. Make sure your field agents are in position at the Atlanta Country Club," I instructed. "He is attending the Sterling Annual Charity Gala tonight to keep up appearances. Do not move in until I give the signal. I want him to feel completely secure right up until the floor collapses beneath him." "We have the perimeter secured," Agent Miller confirmed. "We are ready when you are." I ended the call and slipped the encrypted flash drives into a sleek metallic clutch purse. Bryce was a fool. He actually thought he could use my name to open those dummy accounts. He did not know that I had placed a permanent federal fraud alert on my own Social Security number a year ago, precisely because I knew how my family operated. The moment he tried to forge my signature on those Cayman documents, he tripped a silent federal alarm. He dug his own grave and handed me the shovel. The bedroom door opened slowly. Marcus stepped into the room. He was wearing a sharply tailored black tuxedo that fit perfectly across his broad shoulders. He looked incredibly handsome and utterly dangerous. He walked toward me, his dark eyes sweeping over the emerald silk of my gown. He stopped right in front of me and pulled a long velvet box from his jacket pocket. He popped it open, revealing a breathtaking diamond necklace that caught the light from the chandelier. He stepped behind me, gently sweeping my hair to the side. The cool metal of the necklace settled against my collarbone. "Are you ready to burn their empire down?" Marcus asked softly, his warm breath grazing my neck as he secured the clasp. I looked at our reflection in the large mirror. I saw a woman who had finally stopped trying to save people who were actively drowning her. I picked up my silver clutch and turned to face my husband. "I brought the gasoline," I said. The heavy mahogany doors of the Atlanta Country Club swung inward, pulled open by 2 stoic attendants in pristine white gloves. If you were walking right behind Marcus and me, tracking our shoulders as we crossed the threshold into the opulent ballroom, your view would smoothly pan out to capture the breathtaking scale of the Sterling Annual Charity Gala. The sheer glitz of the event was designed to overwhelm the senses and demand total submission. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted hand-painted ceilings. casting a warm golden glow over the elite black high society of the city. Extravagant floral arrangements of white orchids and rare imported lilies cascaded from towering silver vases on every linen-draped table. The air hummed with the soft melodic rhythm of a live jazz quartet, the sharp clinking of baccarat crystal, and the hushed velvet-draped conversations of generational wealth. Marcus placed a warm, steady hand on the small of my back as we descended the grand marble staircase. The emerald silk of my custom gown pooled and flowed around my legs with every deliberate step, the razor-sharp slit, catching the light and demanding attention. I could feel the weight of the encrypted flash drives resting perfectly inside my metallic clutch. Tonight, I was not the quiet, compliant accountant they had spent decades ignoring. I was the executioner, and I had come to collect. The moment my heel touched the ballroom floor, I felt the immediate shift in the atmosphere. The jazz music did not stop, but the conversations nearest to us certainly did. Eyes darted in our direction, quickly averting when Marcus stared back with a protective, icy glare, only to resume their burning scrutiny the second we passed. My mother, Vivian, had been incredibly efficient. In the few hours since she and Bryce had fled my house in absolute panic, she had managed to completely saturate this ballroom with her twisted version of events. She had already painted me as the desperate, jealous sister who was caught embezzling $8 million, a tragic failure brought down by her own pathetic greed. I could hear the hushed whispers rippling through the crowd, branding me a disappointment and a criminal. We barely made it past the champagne reception when the first wave of the assault arrived. My Aunt Beatrice and Aunt Patricia intercepted us, physically blocking our path to the main dining area. They were my mother's sisters, wrapped tightly in expensive tailored silk and dripping in heavy family heirloom pearls. Beatrice looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the plunging neckline of my gown with poorly disguised disdain. "Naomi, dear!" Beatrice said, her voice intentionally loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables of politicians and judges. "We are simply shocked to see you here tonight. We assumed you would be home packing your things and getting your affairs in order." Vivian came to us in tears. She told us everything about your legal troubles. Patricia offered a tight, deeply condescending smile, stepping closer to pat my arm, as if I were a diseased patient in need of comfort. "We are praying for your soul, Naomi. We truly are. It is such a terrible tragedy when a young woman loses her moral compass. But then again, working those grueling government hours for pennies, it breeds a certain kind of desperation, does it not? Temptation is a terrible thing when you have nothing." I looked at my aunts, these women who had spent my entire life measuring my worth against Chloe and her fabricated successes. Through my work as a senior forensic auditor, I knew exactly how dirty their hands were. I knew for a fact that Aunt Beatrice had not paid capital gains taxes on her investment properties in 4 years, hiding the revenue behind a shell company. I knew Aunt Patricia was heavily leveraged in a commercial real estate scam that the SEC was currently preparing to dismantle. They stood there passing moral judgment, completely blind to the fact that their own financial closets were packed full of federal felonies. "Thank you for your prayers, Aunt Patricia," I said, my voice perfectly measured, radiating a serene calm that clearly unsettled them both. "But you should really save them for yourselves. I have a feeling the IRS is going to be incredibly busy this quarter. You might want to make sure your own offshore ledgers are perfectly balanced before you worry about my moral compass." Patricia's patronizing smile instantly vanished, replaced by a rigid mask of panic. Beatrice took a sharp, unsteady breath, her hand flying up to clutch her pearls as the color drained from her cheeks. I did not wait for their sputtered, terrified responses. I simply nodded, let Marcus guide me smoothly around them, and continued walking through the sea of staring faces. We did not get far before the main event arrived. Chloe spotted me from across the room. She immediately excused herself from a group of local real estate magnates and strutted toward us, leading a small, eager pack of her elite sycophantic friends. She was wearing a blindingly bright diamond-encrusted gown that clung tightly to her frame, playing the role of the radiant, successful, benevolent younger sister to absolute perfection. In her right hand, she casually balanced a crystal flute filled to the brim with vintage champagne. She stopped a few feet away, ensuring she had a captivated audience. The wealthy socialites behind her fanned out their eyes wide with eager anticipation for a public high society scandal. Naomi Chloe gasped, pressing her free hand to her chest in a theatrical display of shock. "You actually showed up. I am absolutely stunned. Bryce and I were just talking about you with the mayor. We were so worried the federal authorities would not even let you leave your house tonight." The surrounding guests stopped pretending to mingle. Everyone in our radius was listening now, hanging on her every word. Chloe took a step closer, her voice pitched perfectly to project maximum pity to the wealthy crowd. "I want you to know that despite the horrible, selfish things you have done to this family, I forgive you. I really do. I cannot imagine the terror of your legal troubles. If you need money for a decent defense attorney, please just ask me. Bryce and I can always dip into our philanthropic fund to keep you out of a federal penitentiary. We take pity on those less fortunate. Charity starts at home, after all." Her elite friends let out a chorus of soft, synchronized titters, thoroughly entertained by the public humiliation. Chloe smiled, a radiant, poisonous smile, lifting her champagne flute to take a celebratory sip of her triumph. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or give the ballroom the angry, unhinged reaction my sister was desperately trying to provoke. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate step directly into Chloe's personal space. She instinctively froze her smug smile, faltering slightly as she looked up into my eyes. She saw no fear, no shame, only absolute cold calculation. I looked down at the crystal flute in her hand. The golden bubbles were rising rapidly to the surface. I leaned in, closing the distance until my lips were just an inch from her ear. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was suffocating, but I did not pull back. "You should not drink champagne if you are pregnant, Chloe," I whispered, my voice dropping to a deadly razor-sharp murmur that only she could hear. "Or is the baby as fake as your revenue reports?" I pulled back just enough to watch the words register. The color completely vanished from Chloe's perfectly contoured face, leaving her ashen. Her eyes went wide with absolute unadulterated terror as she realized I knew everything about her entire fraudulent existence. Her hand began to tremble violently. Her fingers went entirely slack. The crystal flute slipped from her grasp. It plummeted to the floor, shattering loudly against the polished marble and spraying vintage champagne all over the hem of her diamond-encrusted gown. The sharp crack of crystal breaking against the marble floor rang out like a gunshot. The immediate circle of socialites gasped, stepping back to protect their couture from the splashing champagne. Chloe stood completely frozen, staring down at the spreading stain on her diamond-encrusted gown. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and wet with sheer panic. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply turned my back on her, leaving her standing in a puddle of her own terror. Marcus offered a slight, amused shake of his head as he guided me away from the mess and toward our assigned table near the front of the stage. The house lights dimmed, signaling the start of the evening formal program. A hush fell over the room as the master of ceremonies stepped up to the podium. He announced the primary benefactor of the Sterling Annual Charity Gala, Bryce Davenport. If you were watching through a camera lens, it would start with a tight close-up on his perfectly capped teeth before slowly tilting down to capture his impossibly arrogant posture. Bryce adjusted the cuffs of his tuxedo jacket and strode up the stairs to the stage, taking his position behind the crystal podium. He looked out over the sea of faces. The room was filled with Atlanta's most powerful black elite. Judges, politicians, surgeons, and real estate moguls sat at the tables before him. But Bryce did not see a room full of equals. He stood there bathing in the spotlight, playing the ultimate white savior. He leaned into the microphone and began his speech, adopting a tone that was thick with patronizing benevolence. He spoke about Vanguard Horizon and the substantial financial contributions his firm was making to uplift the community. He used words like grace and philanthropy, treating the entire ballroom like a charity case that desperately needed his specific brand of salvation. Then his eyes scanned the front row and locked directly onto me. A cruel, self-satisfied smirk touched the corners of his mouth. He decided to deviate from his prepared remarks. He gripped the edges of the podium and leaned forward. "You know, building a strong community is very much like building a strong family," Bryce said, his voice echoing through the massive sound system. "It requires vigilance. It requires a willingness to make hard choices. A family is like a harvest. To protect the healthy crops, you have to be willing to do the dirty work. You have to be willing to ruthlessly weed out the bad seeds. You have to cut away the rot before it infects the entire legacy." The metaphor was a direct, targeted strike. A few people at the surrounding tables shifted uncomfortably, sensing the underlying venom in his words. But my parents did not hesitate. DeAndre and Vivian broke out into loud, enthusiastic applause. They sat at their VIP table, beaming with pride, clapping for the man who was actively insulting their own daughter in front of the entire city. They were so blinded by their desperate need for proximity to his supposed wealth that they gleefully co-signed my public execution. I sat perfectly still, letting the applause wash over me. I looked at Marcus. He did not say a word. He just gave me a single knowing nod. It was time. I stood up from my chair. The emerald silk of my gown caught the stage lights as I turned and walked away from the table. I did not head toward the exit. I walked with absolute purpose straight down the center aisle, moving toward the massive elevated soundboard stationed at the back of the ballroom. The sound engineer, a young guy wearing heavy headphones, looked up in confusion as I approached his station. I did not slow down. I reached into my metallic clutch and pulled out my federal credentials. I flashed my silver SEC badge directly in his line of sight. "Federal audit." I said, my voice low and authoritative. "Step away from the board right now." The engineer's eyes went wide. He raised his hands in surrender and quickly rolled his chair back, giving me full access to the console. On stage, Bryce was still talking, oblivious to my movement. He was just launching into another self-congratulatory sentence about his ethical investments. I reached across the massive soundboard. I found the main audio fader labeled Podium 1 and ripped the slider all the way down to 0. Bryce's voice was instantly severed. He kept talking for a few seconds before realizing the room was entirely silent. He tapped the microphone. A dull, hollow thud echoed weakly. He frowned, looking off stage in annoyance. I did not give him time to recover. I pulled my encrypted iPad from my clutch and grabbed a spare HDMI cable resting on the console. I plugged it directly into my device, routing my screen straight to the master visual feed. The massive 40-foot projection screens hanging behind the stage flickered. The elegant Sterling Charity logo vanished. In its place, a terrifyingly complex web of offshore bank transfers illuminated the ballroom. Red lines connected Vanguard Horizon directly to shell companies in the Cayman Islands, highlighting stolen funds, illegal wire transfers, and massive corporate fraud. The evidence was 50 feet tall and impossible to ignore. The entire ballroom let out a collective gasp. Bryce whipped around to look at the screens. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tuxedo. I picked up the master PA microphone resting on the soundboard. I flicked the switch to live. The speakers shrieked with a brief, sharp feedback before my voice filled the room. "Let us talk about your harvest, Bryce." The silence in the room was absolute, shattered only by the low hum of the massive projectors, casting harsh, glaring light across Bryce's sweating forehead. If this were a cinematic production, the camera would be whipping frantically back and forth between my cold, unyielding expression at the soundboard, Bryce rapidly unraveling facade on the stage, and the horrified, synchronized gasps escaping the lips of Atlanta's most elite citizens. The intricate web of neon red lines displayed on the 40-foot screens behind him was not a piece of modern abstract art meant to dazzle the charity donors. It was a digital forensic autopsy of Vanguard Horizon, laying bare every financial sin he had committed over the past 36 months. I gripped the heavy microphone, feeling the cool metal ground me to the reality of what I was doing. For the past 3 years, Vanguard Horizon has not been investing your capital in commercial real estate. I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy, perfumed air like a surgical scalpel. It has been operating as a highly sophisticated, aggressively managed Ponzi scheme. Bryce Davenport has been actively using new investments to pay off early stakeholders, while quietly siphoning the vast majority of your capital into a labyrinth of offshore shell companies. I tapped the screen of my encrypted iPad. The massive projection shifted immediately, zooming in on specific damning ledger entries with undeniable clarity. "I see Senator Hastings sitting at table 4, I said, directing my gaze to the prominent politician who was currently choking on his sparkling water. $2 million of your private pension fund was supposedly invested in a luxury high-rise development in Midtown. As you can clearly see right here on the screen, that money was actually wired to an obscure account in the British Virgin Islands under the name Horizon Holdings LLC. That is a shell company registered directly to Bryce's personal wealth manager." I swiped my screen again, bringing up another highlighted transaction in bright yellow. "Judge Carter, you are at table 7. Your family trust invested $4 million last quarter for a stake in the new waterfront commercial district. That money never even touched a domestic account. It was routed through a proxy server in Cyprus and used to cover margin calls on Bryce's failing personal stock investments." The hushed murmurs in the ballroom instantly erupted into chaotic, furious shouts. Chairs scraped loudly and violently against the polished marble floor as several prominent investors stood up, their faces flushed with righteous rage. My mother and father, seated at their prime VIP table, just a few yards from the stage, looked as though they had been physically struck by a freight train. DeAndre's jaw hung slack, his crystal champagne glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. Vivian was clutching her chest, her eyes darting frantically between my calm face at the soundboard and the undeniable evidence flashing on the massive screens. They had spent years hitching their entire social and financial existence to a man who was systematically robbing the very people they were desperately trying to impress. Bryce finally found his voice. "Turn that off," he bellowed, abandoning the crystal podium and stepping forward. He pointed a trembling, sweat-slicked finger at me. "Security, remove this woman immediately. She is a disgruntled, mentally unstable government employee trying to ruin a charity event with fabricated documents. She is having a psychotic break." I did not move an inch. Marcus stood right beside the soundboard, his arms crossed over his chest, his dark eyes daring any security guard in the room to take a step in my direction. None of them moved. I simply tapped my screen again. A high-resolution scanned image of the Cayman Island banking documents, the exact documents my mother had dumped on my porch that morning, appeared in blinding clarity on the screens. "You tried to make me the fall guy, Bryce," I said smoothly, my amplified voice completely overpowering his frantic shouting. "You forged my signature to open these dummy accounts, planning to transfer the remaining stolen assets into my name before the bank regulators and SEC auditors caught on. You thought because I was the quiet, overlooked sister who just did taxes for middle management, I would be the perfect compliant scapegoat. You thought you could harvest my future to fertilize your own greed." The crowd went dead silent again, hanging on my every word. I looked directly into Bryce's panicked, bloodshot eyes. "But you made one monumental, fatal miscalculation." I continued, letting the silence stretch for maximum impact. "I have known exactly what my family is capable of since they forged my signature and stole my college tuition a decade ago. I do not leave things to chance. I placed a permanent maximum security federal fraud alert on my social security number over a year ago, precisely to protect myself from people like you." Bryce took a stumbling step backward as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He bumped into the podium, knocking the microphone stand askew. "The moment you tried to use my identity to open those offshore accounts, you did not create a scapegoat," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and washing over the angry crowd. "You tripped a silent, high-priority alarm directly to the federal authorities. You essentially emailed your confession to the United States government." Bryce's face turned a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. Sweat dripped visibly from his chin, ruining his starched collar and staining his custom tuxedo shirt. The wealthy crowd was physically closing in around the stage. Now their charity gala decorum entirely replaced by the primal anger of people who had just been robbed blind. Men in expensive suits were shouting demands for their money, and several women were already on their phones dialing their own legal counsel. Lies, Bryce screamed, his voice cracking with absolute pathetic desperation. He pounded his fists against his thighs like a petulant child throwing a tantrum. I am a respected Wall Street manager. I manage billions in assets. You are nothing. You are a pathetic, jealous liar trying to destroy a successful man because you have nothing of your own. You made all of this up to ruin me. I stared at him, feeling the absolute intoxicating power of the moment. I had brought the gasoline, and now it was time to strike the match. I tapped my iPad one last time, bringing up a fresh time-stamped wire transfer receipt that completely filled the 40-foot screen behind him. If I am lying, Bryce, my voice boomed through the speakers, cold, steady, and completely devoid of mercy. Why did you wire $2 million to your mistress in Monaco this morning? If there were a camera capturing this precise second, it would execute a violent whip pan directly from the stage, leaving Bryce's terrified, sweating face to push in tightly on Chloe. The absolute destruction of her perfect, heavily curated reality was broadcasting live across her features. Her eyes, normally so full of manufactured warmth and condescending pity, were blown wide in a state of catastrophic shock. The illusion of her flawless marriage, her untouchable social standing, and her immense wealth was fracturing into dust right before her eyes. For a fraction of a second, the entire ballroom held its collective breath. Then cognitive dissonance violently kicked in. Chloe could not process the data. Her brain simply refused to accept that her entire existence was a carefully constructed lie, funded by stolen money, and a husband who despised her. Her shock instantly mutated into unhinged feral rage. She hiked up the heavy champagne-soaked hem of her diamond-encrusted gown and charged through the crowd toward the soundboard. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious hatred. "You are a liar!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the ambient noise of the panicked ballroom. "You are nothing but a pathetic, jealous liar. You have spent your entire miserable life obsessing over me, trying to tear me down because you could never be me. You are making this up to ruin my marriage." She lunged forward, her manicured hands raised like claws, desperately trying to reach across the massive audio console to rip the microphone from my grip. She did not even get close. Marcus stepped forward with lethal grace, placing his broad shoulders squarely between us. He did not touch her, but he formed an impenetrable solid wall of tailored muscle that completely blocked her path. Chloe slammed into his space, forced to recoil, as Marcus stared down at her with an expression of absolute, chilling indifference. "Naomi, tell them it is a lie!" Chloe shrieked, tears of sheer panic finally spilling over her lashes, ruining her flawless makeup. "Tell them you forged those documents because you are sick and jealous. Bryce loves me. He would never do this to me. He is a respected man." I looked down at my younger sister from my elevated position at the console. I felt no anger. I felt no pity. I simply felt the cold, clinical precision of an auditor closing a heavily unbalanced ledger. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice. I simply tapped the screen of my encrypted iPad. The complex web of offshore banking transfers vanished from the 40-foot projection screens. In its place, high-resolution time-stamped surveillance photographs illuminated the ballroom. The images were undeniable. There was Bryce lounging on the deck of a multi-million-dollar yacht off the coast of Saint-Tropez, wrapping his arms around a stunning, deeply tanned blonde woman who was definitely not his wife. Another tap of the screen brought up a photograph of the two of them walking out of a high-end Cartier boutique in Paris, Bryce pressing a kiss to her temple. Kiss, too. Then the final image appeared. It was an official, irrevocable bank wire confirmation. The routing numbers clearly matched Vanguard Horizon's primary capital holding account. The destination was a private banking institution in Monaco. The beneficiary was listed as Eleanor Vane. The amount was exactly $2 million processed and cleared at 8 o'clock this morning. I leaned back into the microphone, letting my voice fill the cavernous room with absolute unyielding truth. "He is not protecting you, Chloe," I announced, the amplified sound cutting through her frantic sobbing. "He is leaving you." The entire launch of Maison Davenport, the designer clothes, the luxury vehicles, none of it was because he loved you. It was a calculated smokescreen. He needed a high-profile, big-spending wife to project an image of endless liquidity to his investors. You were a prop, and today your usefulness officially expired. Chloe staggered backward, as if she had been physically shot. She shook her head side to side, her hands covering her mouth as she stared up at the massive projection of her husband kissing another woman. The only reason he needed me to take the fall today, I continued, my eyes tracking from Chloe to the stage where Bryce was visibly hyperventilating, was so he could board a private jet tonight without the SEC freezing his assets. There is a Gulfstream, fueled and waiting for him on the tarmac at DeKalb Peachtree Airport right now. He needed a distraction. He needed the federal authorities to spend the next 48 hours aggressively raiding my home and freezing my accounts. He set up his own sister-in-law to face 20 years in a federal penitentiary just so he could buy himself enough time to cross the Atlantic and disappear with his mistress. The sheer depravity of the plan sent a fresh wave of disgust rippling through the wealthy crowd. Investors who had previously been shouting for their money were now staring at Bryce with absolute homicidal outrage. Chloe spun around, her diamond gown flashing under the heavy chandeliers. She looked toward the stage, extending a trembling hand toward the man she had anchored her entire identity to. "Bryce," she sobbed, her voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic plea for reassurance. "Bryce, tell them it is a lie. Please tell me she is making this up. Tell me we are going home." But Bryce did not look at her. He did not offer a single word of comfort, denial, or protection. The illusion was dead, and he no longer needed his prop. He completely ignored his wife's existence, aggressively pulling his secure encrypted cell phone from his tuxedo pocket. He turned his back to the ballroom, pressing the phone to his ear with a shaking hand as he frantically dialed his fixer, desperately trying to salvage his escape plan before the federal marshals secured the perimeter of the building. That total callous dismissal broke whatever fragile thread of denial was keeping my family tethered to reality. A sudden violent commotion erupted near the front VIP tables. Vivian shoved her way past a group of stunned politicians, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Her golden child was publicly destroyed. Her social empire was burning to the ground, and her proximity to wealth was entirely decimated. "You ungrateful wretch!" Vivian shrieked, charging the soundboard with a terrifying speed. She lunged toward the platform, raising her hand to slap me across the face. I did not flinch. I did not step back or look to Marcus for protection. As Vivian's hand descended in a vicious arc aimed directly at my cheek, I raised my arm and caught her by the wrist. The sharp crack of flesh hitting flesh echoed over the live microphone, but it was the sound of my palm intercepting her strike. Her forward momentum halted instantly. The camera would orbit us now, circling tight and fast, locking us into a claustrophobic sphere of pure generational hostility. The towering screens flashing offshore accounts faded into the periphery. The gasps of the Atlanta elite dissolved into white noise. There was only my mother and me locked in a violent tableau. Vivian's eyes were wide and manic. The heavy diamond earrings she wore trembled violently as she struggled against my grip. She tried to yank her arm away, but I held her wrist in a vice. The soft, compliant daughter she thought she knew was entirely gone. "You are ruining us!" she screamed, her voice shrill and unhinged, completely devoid of the refined Southern elegance she usually projected. "You are destroying this family name, Naomi. How dare you stand up there and do this to your own sister? How dare you humiliate us in front of the entire city? I gave birth to you. I put a roof over your head. You owe us. You owe this family everything." Her words were not born of shock or betrayal. They were the desperate, panicked demands of a tyrant losing her absolute control. She did not care that Bryce was a criminal. She did not care that he was fleeing the country and leaving Chloe completely destitute. She only cared that the pristine facade of the Davenport family was being publicly dismantled by the very person she had spent a lifetime keeping at the bottom of the hierarchy. I released her wrist with a sudden, forceful shove that made her stumble backward. Her high heels slipped on the polished stage floor, and she barely caught her balance against the edge of the soundboard. I owe you. I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch that the microphone picked up perfectly, carrying it to every corner of the silent, breathless ballroom. The sheer audacity of that statement is breathtaking, Vivian. Let us talk about exactly what I owe you. I stepped down from the soundboard platform, invading her space. She tried to maintain her fierce glare, but I could see the sudden flash of uncertainty behind her perfectly applied mascara. She was finally realizing that I was no longer playing by her rules. When I was 18 years old, I said the words slicing through the heavy air. You marched into a bank and forged my signature. You took out massive, high-interest commercial business loans entirely in my name. You did not do it to help me. You did it to fund Chloe. Very first failed luxury boutique because you knew her own credit was already garbage. You chained hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt to my social security number without my knowledge. Vivian opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off, my voice rising in volume and authority. You ruined my credit for 10 years, I stated unequivocally, locking my eyes onto hers. While Chloe was playing pretend CEO and driving that boutique straight into bankruptcy within 6 months, I was getting denied for basic college apartments. I was getting rejected for student car loans. I spent my entire 20s fighting off aggressive debt collectors and working night shifts at a diner to pay off settlements for a business I never even set foot in. You stole my financial independence before my adult life even began. You did not give birth to a daughter, Vivian. You gave birth to a human shield. The crowd around the stage erupted into a fresh wave of disgusted murmurs. The socialites who had spent the evening exchanging air kisses with my mother were now looking at her with absolute revulsion. In the world of high finance and elite society, stealing from your own child to fund a vanity project was a cardinal sin. It was common and pathetic and undeniably dirty. You are lying, Vivian hissed, looking frantically over her shoulder at the judging faces pressing in around us. She is lying. She has always been a bitter, jealous liar. She just wants attention. I am an auditor, I reminded her coldly. Do you really think I would stand in front of this room without the receipts? I have every single loan application, every forged signature, and every default notice digitized and ready to send to the district attorney. The statute of limitations on bank fraud might be tricky, but the civil litigation will absolutely bankrupt whatever is left of your retirement fund. I watched the realization hit her. The terrifying understanding that I had spent years quietly assembling a bulletproof case against my own blood. I was not just burning Bryce down tonight. I was burning the entire corrupt ecosystem that allowed him to thrive. Bryce had only thought to use my identity for his Cayman Island accounts because Vivian had set the precedent. She had taught him that Naomi was disposable. She had given him the blueprint for my destruction. Enough. The single word boomed through the ballroom. The crowd parted as my father, DeAndre, stepped forward. He moved with the heavy, imposing authority of a patriarch who was used to absolute obedience. He marched straight to the edge of the stage, inserting his large frame into the tight space between my mother and me. He puffed out his chest, looking down at me with a deeply practiced scowl that had kept me terrified of him for the first 2 decades of my life. You will stop this presentation immediately, Naomi DeAndre commanded, his deep baritone voice echoing with sheer, unadulterated entitlement. You are having a hysterical episode and you are embarrassing yourself. Turn off those screens right now. Whatever issues you have with Bryce or your mother, we handle them privately, behind closed doors. You do not disrespect the head of this family in public. Apologize to your mother and step away from that equipment before I make you step away. He stood there completely oblivious to the shifting reality of the room, relying on outdated intimidation tactics to put me back in my place. He genuinely believed his booming voice and patriarchal authority could override hard evidence and federal crimes. He thought he could command the tide to stop rising. I looked at him. I did not blink. I did not cower. I just stared at the man who had spent his life enabling my abuse while demanding my respect. My face remained an absolutely blank, deadpan mask. Dad, I said, my voice perfectly steady. You might want to look at slide number 4 before you defend him. DeAndre's booming voice hung in the heavy air, rapidly losing its power as the absolute silence of the room swallowed it whole. He glared down at me, his chest heaving with patriarchal indignation, fully expecting me to cower, apologize, and shut down the monitors, just as I had always done whenever he raised his voice. But my unwavering stare finally pierced through his towering ego. The realization that his intimidation tactics held absolutely zero weight anymore caused a slight tremor in his jaw. Slowly, almost mechanically, he turned his heavy frame away from the soundboard and looked toward the massive 40-foot projection screens illuminating the stage. If a camera were capturing this precise moment, the lens would push in tight on DeAndre's face. Tracking the exact millisecond, his arrogant scowl dissolved into pure, unadulterated horror. The whites of his eyes widened, tracking the digital ledger I had just pulled onto the master display. Slide 4 was not a generalized summary of Vanguard Horizon corporate malfeasance. It was a highly personalized, surgically precise breakdown of the Sterling Family Trust. I tapped the screen of my iPad, highlighting a specific string of transactions in a glowing, undeniable yellow. DeAndre's lips parted, but the breath seemed to completely leave his lungs. The entire room watched in morbid fascination as a wire transfer receipt materialized on the screen, detailing the total liquidation of my father's primary retirement account. $5.8 million. It had been withdrawn in 4 separate tranches over the last 6 months, deliberately routed to bypass the mandated dual signature authorizations that my father had insisted upon. The destination was not a secure domestic municipal bond fund, as Bryce had promised him during our lavish Thanksgiving dinner. It was a highly leveraged, speculative crypto exchange account based out of Malta, an exchange that had officially filed for international bankruptcy protection exactly 3 weeks ago. The money was not just missing, it was vaporized, but the liquidation of his liquid retirement assets was only the preamble to his true devastation. I swiped to the next document, expanding a heavily redacted legal contract so the fine print was visible to the back of the room. "Read the collateral line, Dad," my voice echoed cold and unyielding over the PA system. DeAndre stumbled a half-step forward, his polished dress shoes scraping against the floorboards. He squinted at the screen, his broad shoulders trembling. They're bearing Bryce Davenport, digitally authenticated signature acting as a proxy wealth manager, was the deed to the Sterling family estate, the sprawling historic property in Buckhead that my father had spent 30 years paying off. The crown jewel of our family generational wealth. The sacred, manicured ground where Vivian hosted her endless, pretentious society galas. Bryce had quietly leveraged the entire estate against a $30 million high-risk offshore loan. A loan that, according to the bright red default notice flashing beside the deed, was 90 days past due. The bank essentially owned their legacy. DeAndre's whole body began to shake. This was the man who had always demanded absolute respect, who measured a person worth entirely by their net worth and their proximity to power. He had happily sacrificed his own daughter's dignity to maintain his connection to Bryce, supposed white shoe brilliance. He had worshipped his son-in-law. He had held Bryce up as the ultimate gold standard of financial success, constantly reminding me that if I applied myself and stopped being so difficult, I might one day be worthy of working for a firm as prestigious as Vanguard Horizon. He had enthusiastically applauded Bryce's thinly veiled insults mere minutes ago. And now the irrefutable truth was staring him in the face. Bryce had not just stolen his money. He had systematically stripped the Sterling family down to the copper wiring. Every ounce of sweat, every strategic social maneuver, every ethical compromise my father had made to secure his position as a pillar of Atlanta black elite had been harvested, packaged, and burned by the man standing 3 feet away from him. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal broke something fundamental inside DeAndre. His imposing stature seemed to physically deflate the starch leaving his spine as he turned away from the devastating screens and looked directly at Bryce. Bryce was no longer attempting to project the image of a confident Wall Street titan. He was frantically mashing buttons on his secure phone, sweating profusely, his eyes darting wildly toward the side doors of the ballroom where 2 federal agents had just appeared, their silver badges glinting under the emergency exit signs. He did not even have the decency to look my father in the eye. Bryce DeAndre said, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper that carried no trace of its former booming authority. Bryce completely ignored him, pressing the phone harder to his ear, desperately barking orders at his fixer to secure a route to the private airfield. Bryce DeAndre roared, the paralyzing shock finally giving way to a blinding primal fury. My father lunged forward with terrifying speed. He closed the distance between them in two massive strides, his large hands reaching out and grabbing fistfuls of Bryce's custom-tailored tuxedo jacket. He slammed Bryce backward against the edge of the crystal podium, the violent impact knocking the breath from the younger man's lungs and sending the microphone stand crashing to the floor. "You stole my home!" DeAndre bellowed, spittle flying from his lips as he shook the man he had once called a son. "You bankrupted my family. You took everything I built." Bryce dropped his phone. The device clattered against the wooden floorboards of the stage. For a fraction of a second, he looked genuinely terrified of the massive, furious man pinning him down under the harsh stage lights. But as DeAndre continued to shake him, demanding answers, the panic in Bryce's eyes mutated into something entirely different. It morphed into pure, unadulterated contempt. The mask of the benevolent, philanthropic savior completely dissolved, leaving only the ugly, entitled reality beneath. With a sudden vicious surge of adrenaline, Bryce braced his forearms against my father's chest and violently shoved him. He threw his entire body weight into the push. My father, caught off guard and already breathless with shock, stumbled backward. His leather soles slipped on the polished marble step of the stage, and he crashed down hard, falling flat onto his back in front of the entire stunned ballroom. Bryce straightened his ruined jacket, his chest heaving as he sneered down at the man who had treated him like royalty. "Get your hands off me, old man!" Bryce spat, his voice laced with venom and a naked racist arrogance that finally laid his true nature bare for the whole world to see. "You were nothing but a diversity prop for my firm anyway." The impact of my father hitting the polished marble floor sent a sickening thud through the grand ballroom. The collective gasp of the Atlanta elite was instantaneous, followed immediately by the frantic murmurs and the sudden, undeniable flashing of smartphone cameras. The city's most powerful citizens were no longer just horrified spectators. They were actively documenting the absolute catastrophic destruction of the Davenport legacy. DeAndre, a man who had spent his entire adult life cultivating an aura of untouchable prestige, lay sprawled on his back, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the shattering realization that his empire was gone and his idol despised him. Bryce stood over him, his chest expanding with ragged breaths, his expensive tuxedo twisted and ruined by sweat and panic. He looked down at my father with an expression of such pure, venomous disgust that it made the surrounding socialites physically recoil. But before Bryce could open his mouth to spit another racial slur or hurl another insult, the dynamic on the stage shifted with terrifying fluidity. Marcus moved. He did not rush. He did not shout. He glided across the stage with the silent, lethal grace of a predator who had cornered his prey hours ago and was only now deciding to step into the light. The movement was so smooth, so perfectly balanced, that it felt cinematic, as if a Steadicam were tracking his every step, gliding right alongside him as he inserted himself directly between Bryce and my fallen father. Marcus came to a halt, standing tall and utterly unbothered, his dark eyes locked onto Bryce. With a calm, deliberate motion, Marcus reached down and casually adjusted his silver cufflinks, smoothing the immaculate sleeves of his tailored suit. Bryce let out a harsh, derisive scoff, trying to mask his rising panic with another layer of aggressive arrogance. He took a step forward, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate my husband, but Marcus did not yield a single fraction of an inch. "Back off, Marcus," Bryce spat, pointing a trembling finger at my husband's chest. "This has absolutely nothing to do with you. You are just a glorified draftsman married to a psychotic bureaucrat. Get out of my way before I have you arrested for trespassing on my stage." Marcus did not drop his calm, level gaze. He finished adjusting his left cuff and casually dropped his hands to his sides. Bryce sneered, a manic, desperate energy taking over his features. He turned his attention back to me, shouting over Marcus' shoulder, "You think you have won, Naomi. You think projecting some wire transfers and a few photos of a yacht trip actually proves anything in a court of law. You are pathetic. Those are proxy accounts. They are completely untraceable. Any decent corporate lawyer will have this entire display thrown out as fabricated, illegally obtained garbage. You have no hard evidence. You have absolutely nothing." He laughed, a harsh grating sound that bordered on hysterical. "I manage billions of dollars." Bryce continued, his ego inflating his chest as he paced a tight circle on the stage. "You think I would leave the master ledgers anywhere a low-level SEC desk jockey could find them? You think I am stupid enough to keep the real data on a cloud server that can be subpoenaed? I have an offshore, completely air-gapped server. It holds the real books, the raw data, the master client lists, and the foundational algorithms of Vanguard Horizon. It is entirely off the grid. It does not touch the internet. It cannot be hacked, it cannot be audited, and it cannot be touched by you, by the feds, or by anyone else in this miserable room. As long as I control that server, Vanguard Horizon survives, and I am untouchable." He stood there panting, looking out at the crowd with a defiant, crazed expression, genuinely believing he still held the ultimate trump card. He thought he had outsmarted the federal government, his investors, and my entire family. Marcus stopped him with a single quiet chuckle. The sound was low, but it cut through Bryce's manic rant like a gunshot. Bryce snapped his attention back to my husband, his eyes narrowing in furious confusion. Marcus smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a cold, calculated, devastating expression of absolute victory. "You mean the server room hidden directly beneath the Vanguard Horizon basement?" Marcus asked, his voice smooth and carrying perfectly across the silent ballroom. The color instantly completely drained from Bryce's face. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by a look of sheer paralyzing terror. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Marcus took one slow, measured step forward, forcing Bryce to retreat. "You mean the concrete, reinforced subterranean vault?" Marcus continued, his tone conversational, but dripping with lethal intent. "The one with the biometric titanium door and the independent off-grid power supply. The specific room you hired my architectural firm to soundproof, climate control, and structurally reinforce exactly 6 months ago." Bryce staggered backward, his knees visibly buckling. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff in the dark. "How could you know?" He whispered, the words barely escaping his throat. "It was a blind contract. The NDA was absolute." "It was a blind contract," Marcus agreed, tilting his head slightly. "And you used a proxy holding company to hire us." "Very clever, Bryce. But you forgot one crucial detail about commercial architecture in downtown Atlanta. The structural integrity of a subterranean vault requires extensive, highly detailed load-bearing assessments. I am not just a draftsman. I am the lead architect and the managing partner of my firm. I review every single major structural modification that comes across my desk. When I saw the geographical coordinates for a highly classified, heavily fortified basement build-out that perfectly matched the address of my brother-in-law, supposedly transparent investment firm, I took a very special, very personal interest in the project. Bryce was shaking uncontrollably now. His eyes darted frantically around the room, realizing the walls were completely closing in. Marcus reached into the interior pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He moved slowly, deliberately, ensuring every eye in the room was focused entirely on his hand. He pulled out a small, sleek silver thumb drive and held it up between his index finger and thumb, the metal catching the glare of the stage lights. As the lead architect of record, I had a legal and professional obligation to ensure absolute building code compliance, Marcus said, his voice ringing with undeniable authority, which meant I was legally required to turn over the unredacted blueprints, the structural schematics, and the digital master access codes to the city inspectors to secure the necessary permits. Marcus lowered his hand, his dark eyes locking onto Bryce with a devastating final intensity. "And since my firm operates with complete transparency," Marcus added, the cold smile returning to his face, "I also made sure to turn those exact same blueprints, bypass protocols, and master access codes directly over to my wife." The silence that followed Marcus's revelation was not the shocked, breathless quiet of a crowd waiting for a punchline. It was the heavy terminal silence of a firing squad taking aim. Bryce's knees finally gave out. He did not fall, he simply folded, sinking against the ruined crystal podium as the two federal agents who had been waiting at the perimeter finally breached the stage stairs. Their silver badges caught the harsh overhead lights, signaling the absolute end of the Vanguard Horizon Empire. As the agents hauled a stammering, suddenly pathetic Bryce to his feet and roughly secured his wrists behind his back, a slow, emotional pull-out shot would perfectly capture the shifting gravity of the room. It would start tight on the frantic, scrambling mass of elite donors fleeing the ballroom to call their attorneys, pan past the federal agents leading the architect of their ruin away, and finally settle right in the center of the stage, isolating the true casualty of the night. Chloe. She stood frozen for a few agonizing seconds, watching the man she had anchored her entire identity to being marched toward a 20-year federal sentence. He did not look back at her. He did not yell for his lawyers to help his wife. He left her standing there, completely exposed to the financial and social slaughter he had engineered. The realization hit Chloe with the physical force of a wrecking ball. The unhinged adrenaline that had fueled her charge at the soundboard evaporated, leaving nothing but cold, paralyzing terror. Slowly, her legs lost the ability to support her. She dropped to her knees on the polished wood of the stage. The heavy diamond-encrusted champagne silk of her couture gown pooled around her in a glittering, pathetic puddle. She looked incredibly small, a broken porcelain doll discarded in the center of a very public, very brutal arena. Every lie she had meticulously curated over the past decade was dissolving into ash. There was no untouchable wealth. There was no adoring, powerful husband. The phantom pregnancy she had been strategically teasing to the society blogs to secure her status was now a useless hollow prop. She was not the queen of Atlanta's young elite. She was the bankrupt, abandoned wife of a convicted fraudster, drowning in millions of dollars of insurmountable debt that Bryce had undoubtedly attached to her name. She slowly raised her head, her tear-streaked face turning toward me. The haughty, condescending sneer that had defined her features since childhood was entirely gone, replaced by the desperate, wide-eyed panic of a drowning woman searching for a piece of driftwood. Naomi. She choked out her voice, a ragged, pathetic rasp that barely carried over the remaining hum of the ballroom. I stepped down from the soundboard platform, moving slowly down the center aisle toward the stage. Marcus walked a steady pace right beside me, a silent, immovable guard. I stopped at the edge of the stage, looking down at my younger sister. "Naomi, please," Chloe begged, crawling an inch forward on her knees, uncaring of the dirt on the stage floor ruining her dress. "Please, you have to help me. They are going to take everything. The house, the cars, the accounts. He put my name on the domestic holding companies. They are going to come after me for the debt." I stared at her, my expression an absolute unyielding blank. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy. I just felt the cold, clinical finality of a long overdue reckoning. "You have money," Chloe babbled, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic, hyperventilating rush. "You have a federal salary, you have Marcus, you have savings. You can hire me a defense attorney. You can help me pay off the immediate liens so I do not go to prison. We can fix this. Please, Naomi. We are family. We are sisters." The word hung in the air, desperate and manipulative. Sisters. It was a card she only ever played when she was cornered, a word she weaponized whenever she needed to extract resources, sympathy, or compliance. I looked at her trembling hands, then up to her desperate eyes. Sisters. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "That is a very interesting concept, Chloe. Let us talk about sisterhood." I took a slow, deliberate step up onto the stage, my heels clicking sharply against the wood. Where was this profound sense of sisterhood 10 years ago? I asked, my voice carrying the steady, chilling cadence of a prosecutor laying out a closing argument. Where was it when you and Vivian forged my signature to secure the business loans for your luxury boutique? Where was this bond when you knowingly tied hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt to my name so you could play a wealthy entrepreneur? Chloe flinched, her eyes darting to the floor, but I did not let her look away. I remember exactly where you were. I continued, the memories hardening my voice into steel. I remember coming home to our parents' house after working a 14-hour double shift at the diner. I smelled like grease and bleach. I had burns on my arms from the fryers. I was eating 90-cent ramen noodles in the kitchen because every single dollar of my paycheck was going to the collection agencies harassing me over the loans you defaulted on. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but a sharp, authoritative glare from me silenced her. You walked into the kitchen that night wearing a $2,000 pair of red-bottom heels, I said, closing the distance between us. You had a brand new Chanel bag hooked over your arm. You looked at me sitting there exhausted and starving, paying for your failures, and you laughed. You actually laughed. You told me I looked pathetic. You told me that if I just applied myself and had a little more ambition, I would not be stuck working a minimum wage job. You mocked me for the poverty that you explicitly created, Naomi. I was young. Chloe sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I was stupid. I did not understand what I was doing to you. You understood exactly what you were doing. I countered, my tone completely devoid of mercy. You just did not care because I was the designated collateral damage of your life. You and Vivian built your entire reality by cannibalizing my future. You thought you could keep stepping on my neck to keep your head above water forever. But the water just got too deep, Chloe. And Bryce just tied an anchor to your ankle. I stepped right up to the spot where she was kneeling. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer her comfort. I slowly crouched down, bringing my face level with hers, forcing her to look into my eyes and see the absolute terrifying reflection of her own ruin. I am not your safety net. Chloe, I whispered, my voice cold, sharp, and final. I am your karma, and karma doesn't write checks. I stood up, leaving Chloe sobbing into the palms of her hands. The heavy diamond-encrusted silk of her dress looked like a discarded, ruined costume pooling around her knees. I did not offer her a backward glance or a single ounce of the pity she was so desperately trying to extract from me. A harsh, frantic scraping sound drew my attention toward the center of the stage. When Bryce had slammed my father into the crystal podium, the violent impact had knocked over the thick leather-bound dossier I had placed there earlier. The physical backup copies of the digital evidence, the bank statements, the forged signatures, the offshore routing numbers were now scattered in a chaotic mess across the polished mahogany floorboards. And there was Vivian, the undisputed queen of Atlanta high society, a woman who spent hours every single morning perfectly curating her untouchable, elegant image, was currently on her hands and knees. Looking down over my own shoulder, I watched my mother scrambling across the stage like a feral, cornered animal. Her manicured acrylic nails scrabbled uselessly against the smooth wood as she frantically tried to gather the torn, scattered printed documents. She was hyperventilating, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as she snatched up pages of financial ruin. She crushed the papers against her chest, desperately trying to hide them, behaving as if concealing the physical paper would somehow magically erase the 40-foot-high digital projections still illuminating the entire room behind her. It was a pathetic, highly irrational display of pure panic. Vivian actually believed she could shove the hard evidence into her designer clutch, smooth down her gown, and walk out of the ballroom with her pristine reputation intact. She snatched a page detailing Chloe's string of boutique bankruptcies, crumpling it violently in her fist. Her heavy diamond earrings swung wildly, catching the harsh glare of the stage spotlights as she crawled across the floorboards. Beyond the edge of the stage, the initial breathless shock of the elite crowd had rapidly morphed into something much more dangerous. The polite, hushed silence had shattered into a vicious, buzzing hive of eager whispers. I looked out into the sea of evening gowns and tailored tuxedos. Every single smartphone in the front 3 rows was held high in the air. The glowing screens reflected back at us, recording every miserable, undignified second of the Sterling family implosion. The very people Vivian had spent decades trying to impress, the wealthy judges of her beloved country clubs. The rival matriarchs, the board members of her charities, were now actively capturing her public humiliation in high definition. They were not looking at her with sympathy or offering to help. They were looking at her with absolute, unfiltered disgust. The pristine, untouchable facade of the perfect Southern family was tearing itself apart right in front of their eyes, and these socialites were happily feeding on the carcass. Vivian must have felt the collective burning weight of their judgment raining down on her. She froze on her hands and knees, her head snapping up to look at the sea of recording phones, capturing her on the floor. The reality of her total social execution finally registered in her manic, wide eyes. She looked at the crumpled papers clutched in her hands, then at Bryce being hauled roughly toward the exit by federal agents, then at my father still struggling to catch his breath where he had fallen. Finally, her wild, terrified gaze snapped to Chloe. A chilling, desperate calculation washed over Vivian's face. She dropped the crumpled papers, letting them scatter back across the floor. She scrambled backward on her knees, putting physical distance between herself and the daughter she had spent a lifetime spoiling and protecting. It was Chloe. Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking and echoing shrilly across the ballroom without the need for a microphone. It was all Chloe. Chloe lifted her tear-streaked face, her jaw dropping open as she stared at our mother in complete, paralyzing disbelief. "She is the one who told Bryce to do it!" Vivian screamed, pointing a violently trembling finger directly at her golden child. "Chloe told Bryce to use your name, Naomi. She begged him to do it. She said you had no assets to seize anyway. She said nobody would care if a diner waitress had her credit ruined because you were never going to amount to anything. I did not know the extent of the fraud. I was just trying to protect the family. I was just trying to keep us out of the tabloids. It was all her idea. She made him do it to fund that ridiculous failing boutique." The absolute silence that followed Vivian's accusation was deafening. Chloe's mouth opened and closed, but she could not force a single sound past her lips. The ultimate betrayal had just been delivered, not by a jealous sister or a criminal husband, but by the very architect of her entitlement. Vivian was willingly, eagerly throwing her favorite child into the federal fire to salvage whatever pathetic scraps of her own social standing remained. She was offering Chloe up as a human shield, completely discarding her the exact same way they had both discarded me for decades. I watched the exchange with a profound, icy detachment. This was the rotting core of the Sterling family dynamic, finally stripped of its wealth and its pretense. They were not a family. They were a syndicate of parasites, and the exact second the host died, they immediately turned on each other to survive. I took 2 slow, measured steps forward, closing the distance to the overturned crystal podium. I crouched down, but I did not reach out to help my mother gather her useless papers. I reached past her trembling hands and picked up the microphone Bryce had dropped during the scuffle. I stood tall, gripping the mic. A sharp, high-pitched whine of feedback pierced the air for a fraction of a second, instantly commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the ballroom. The frantic whispering ceased. The camera flashes continued to pulse rapidly in the darkened room. I looked down at Vivian. She was still kneeling on the floor amidst the scattered evidence of her federal crimes, looking up at me with a pathetic, desperate plea in her eyes. She was silently begging me to corroborate her lie, to play along with her delusion, to save her from the wolves she had invited into our home. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice was dangerously quiet, carrying a razor-sharp clarity that reached the furthest corners of the massive space. "You'd sacrifice your golden child just to save your country club membership. Mother, you really are hollow." The microphone feedback died down, leaving a silence so absolute it felt physical. Naomi stood motionless on the stage, the mic still in her hand, her eyes locked on Vivian, who remained huddled on the floor. But Bryce was no longer paying attention to the Sterling family implosion. His tunnel vision was entirely consumed by the 2 men in dark suits now navigating the edge of the stage, their movements calculated and unhurried. He knew those suits. They were the end of everything. Bryce pivoted his movements, jerky and panicked. He did not look at Chloe, who was still kneeling and trembling in the ruin of her couture gown, nor did he offer a single glance toward Vivian, who was still shivering amidst the scattered remains of their fraudulent legacy. He didn't care about his wife or his mother-in-law anymore. They were liabilities, now dead weight, dragging him toward the dark reality he had spent years trying to outrun. He saw only the exit sign glowing red above the service door and bolted. The Steadicam operator caught the movement, instantly tracking Bryce as he launched himself into a dead sprint. He shoved aside a startled waiter carrying a silver tray, sending a cascade of crystal flutes crashing to the polished floor with a sound like shattering ice. The elite guests parted like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid hunger as they pulled out their phones to broadcast the spectacle. Bryce ignored the insults, the cameras, and the frantic shouting from his security team. His lungs burned, his polished shoes skidded on the slick marble of the dance floor, and the exit sign loomed larger with every stride. He hit the heavy brushed metal doors with his shoulder, bursting out of the ballroom and into the service corridor. The air here was cooler, smelling of industrial cleaning supplies and stale coffee. He didn't slow down, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind already racing through the route to the valet stand. He just needed to get to the car. Once he reached the garage, he could get on the road, get to the airfield, and be on a flight to the Caymans before anyone could process the digital evidence Naomi had just laid out. He was inches away from the exterior door. He could see the valet stand through the reinforced glass. He was almost free. Then the door opened. Bryce didn't stop intending to shoulder his way past whoever was entering, but his momentum was halted instantly. He slammed into a wall of solid muscle and tailored wool. The impact forced the air from his lungs. He stumbled back, shaking his head, blinking against the sudden transition from the bright ballroom to the dim fluorescent hallway. Standing directly in his path, looking entirely unbothered, was Marcus. Marcus stood with his hands tucked into his pockets, his posture relaxed, his expression mild. He might have been waiting for an elevator rather than standing as the final gatekeeper for a man who had just lost everything. "Get out of my way, Marcus!" Bryce roared, his voice cracking with desperation. He lunged forward, his right hand curling into a fist, aiming a wild, uncoordinated blow toward Marcus' face. He was not a fighter, he was a manager of numbers and systems, and he was terrified. Marcus didn't even flinch. He saw the punch coming with the same analytical precision he applied to architectural schematics. His left hand moved in a blur, effortlessly catching Bryce's fist in midair. The grip was ironclad. Bryce struggled, his knuckles turning white as he tried to pull back, but Marcus didn't let go. Instead, Marcus took a small, efficient step forward, pivoting his hips and using Bryce's own momentum against him. He twisted the younger man's arm behind his back with one smooth, disciplined motion. Bryce yelped, his face crashing into the cold concrete of the hallway wall. Marcus pinned him there, pressing his weight firmly against Bryce's back, ensuring the man couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and certainly couldn't run. The sound of Bryce panting was the only noise in the corridor, save for the muffled, cheering roar of the ballroom behind them. Marcus leaned in close to Bryce, his voice quiet, steady, and terrifyingly cold. "You spend your entire life building these elaborate, fragile houses of cards," Marcus whispered, applying just enough pressure to make Bryce groan. "You think you are the smartest person in every room. You think you can build underground vaults, leverage other people's lives for your own gain, and step on anyone who looks like they might be a threat to your status." Bryce tried to turn his head, but Marcus held him fast, his fingers digging into Bryce's shoulder blade. "I've been watching you for a very long time," Marcus continued. "I've watched how you operate. I've watched how you think you can control people like Naomi and discard them when you are finished. And I've watched how you thought you could play games with my wife." Bryce gasped, the reality of his situation sinking in. "You think you are just playing a game of numbers," Marcus said, his grip tightening. "But you made a fundamental error. You forgot that some things in life have a structural foundation that you cannot undermine. You drop boxes on my porch, you threaten my wife, and you think you get to just walk away." The hallway door creaked open behind them. A frantic security guard from the ballroom peered inside his hand, hovering over his holster. He saw Marcus pinning Bryce against the wall and froze, unsure of the situation. Marcus didn't look at him. He kept his eyes locked on Bryce, who was now weeping, the arrogance entirely replaced by the gut-wrenching fear of impending imprisonment. "Call the police!" Marcus ordered the guard without turning his head. He didn't need to specify which ones. The federal agents were already spilling out of the ballroom, their heavy boots thudding against the floor as they converged on the hallway. Marcus held Bryce there, a silent sentinel of justice, as the agents moved in. They did not need to run now. The trap was sprung, the blueprints had been read, and the structure of Bryce Davenport life had been demolished. Marcus finally released his hold, stepping back and brushing off his suit as if he had just touched something deeply unclean. As the agents wrestled Bryce into cuffs and dragged him toward the exit, he looked back at Marcus one last time, his eyes pleading, his mouth hanging open in a silent, useless protest. Marcus didn't offer a final word. He just stood there, straightened his tie, and turned his back on the man who had thought he could outrun his own shadow. I watched the heavy brushed metal doors of the service corridor swing shut, cutting off the frantic sounds of Bryce being subdued by Marcus and the vanguard of federal agents. The problem of Bryce Davenport had been handled. I turned my back on the exit and faced the sprawling ballroom. The profound, suffocating silence that had gripped the room only moments ago was beginning to fracture. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling arched windows of the Vanguard Horizon Country Club, a chaotic rhythmic strobing began to paint the pristine glass. Red, blue, red, blue. The harsh, unnatural colors sliced through the dim, elegant mood lighting of the gala, washing over the pale, terrified faces of Atlanta elite. Then came the sound. It started as a distant, high-pitched wail echoing over the manicured hills of the golf course, cutting through the humid night air. Within seconds it multiplied. It was not just one or two patrol cars. It was an entire fleet. The sound swelled from a faint warning into a deafening mechanical roar, completely surrounding the perimeter of the clubhouse. The polite, hushed murmurs of the elite crowd instantly spiked into a frantic, disorganized frenzy. Women in couture gowns grabbed their husbands' arms, their carefully applied makeup masking pure terror. Men in bespoke tuxedos frantically pulled out their phones, dialing their defense attorneys. Their previous judgment and disgust at my family public meltdown had evaporated, replaced by the terrifying realization that they were currently trapped inside an active federal crime scene. Several guests scrambled toward the velvet-draped side exits, only to find their path blocked by the event security staff, who stood firm, likely realizing their hefty paychecks were bouncing tonight. Vivian heard the sirens and lost whatever fragile grip she had left on her sanity. She scrambled up from the floorboards, her hands empty, her dignity completely stripped away. She stared at the flashing lights illuminating the windows, her face twisting into a mask of absolute, unadulterated horror. She started screaming. The sound was guttural, the raw, unfiltered panic of a woman watching her kingdom burn to the ground. She spun around wildly, her heavy diamond necklace catching the violent strobe of the police lights, looking for a way out that did not exist. I shifted my gaze a few feet away toward the edge of the stage. My father DeAndre had been hoisted into a gilded velvet chair by a terrified caterer. He was completely catatonic. The imposing, ruthless patriarch who had spent his entire life bullying competitors, manipulating markets, and ignoring his eldest daughter was now reduced to a hollow, trembling shell. His jaw hung slack. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring fixedly at the massive digital projection screen, still illuminating his financial ruin above us. The shock of losing his wealth, his legacy, and his freedom in a single hour had entirely short-circuited his brain. He did not flinch at the deafening sirens. He did not react to his wife screaming right next to him. He did not even twitch as the red and blue lights washed over his ashen face. He was already a ghost trapped in the wreckage of his own hubris. Vivian lunged towards me, her manicured fingers clawing at the air. She stopped just inches away, perhaps remembering the cold, unyielding steel in my eyes from moments ago. Her chest heaved under the ruined silk of her dress. She pointed a trembling finger at the windows, then violently jabbed it toward my chest. "What did you do?" Vivian shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams rising above the chaos of the room. "What did you do, Naomi? Those are police. You called the police on your own family, over money, over some pathetic ancient grudge. You are destroying everything. Tell them to leave. Tell them it is a mistake." I looked down at her, my expression an absolute unyielding blank. "You still do not understand, do you?" "Mother," I asked, my voice carrying the steady, chilling cadence of a judge delivering a final sentence. "You think this is a petty family dispute. You actually believe I called a couple of local patrol cars because I was angry about being left out of your perfect little narrative. I took a deliberate step toward her, forcing her to shrink back. I did not call 911 this morning, I said, making sure every single syllable landed like a physical blow. I called my contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission. I handed over a complete unredacted 60-page dossier to the FBI Financial Crimes Division. I gave them the routing numbers to Bryce offshore accounts, the forged signatures you and Chloe used for the boutique loans, and the exact locations of DeAndre hidden physical ledgers. Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Her legs finally gave out entirely, and she sank back to her knees, the last ounce of fight draining out of her body. They have been building a case against Vanguard Horizon for 18 months. I continued, my voice projecting clearly over the rising wail of the sirens outside. They knew the numbers were dirty, but they just needed the inside man. They needed the key to the vault. I handed it to them on a silver platter. Every fraudulent transfer, every fake asset declaration, every single lie that built this ballroom, the country club, and your entire existence is currently sitting on a federal server. The sound of heavy tires screeching and large vehicles slamming into park echoed from the sweeping driveway outside. The flashing red and blue lights were now blindingly intense, casting long, frantic shadows across the high ceilings of the ballroom. The panicked chatter of the high society guests reached a fever pitch as they saw the silhouettes of heavily armed personnel moving past the frosted glass of the main entrance. "You wanted me to disappear, Mother," I whispered, leaning down, so only she could hear the absolute finality in my tone. "You wanted me to stay in the shadows so your perfect family could shine." Well, I stepped into the light, and I brought the entire federal government with me. The heavy brass-studded main doors of the ballroom exploded open. The solid oak splintered against the marble walls with a concussive crack that instantly silenced the screaming crowd. A massive swarm of men and women in dark tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers flooded into the space, their movements swift, organized, and completely unyielding. "Nobody moves, FBI." The command ripped through the ballroom with the force of a physical shockwave. The panicked murmurs, the frantic dialing of cell phones, the rustling of expensive silk, all of it died instantly. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents fanned out across the room, their boots striking the polished marble floors in a heavy, synchronized rhythm that signaled the absolute end of the line. They secured the side exits, blocked the grand mahogany double doors, and formed a solid, impenetrable perimeter around the stage. The red and blue strobe lights from the fleet of cruisers outside washed over their navy blue windbreakers, illuminating the bold yellow FBI lettering across their backs. Through the shattered remnants of the main entrance, another figure emerged from the dim service hallway. It was Marcus. He did not look winded. He did not look panicked. He walked with the calm, methodical stride of a man who had simply finished taking out the trash. His right hand was twisted firmly into the collar of Bryce-tailored tuxedo jacket. He was practically dragging the architect of the Vanguard Horizon fraud back into the glaring spotlight of the ballroom. Bryce was a complete, unrecognizable wreck. His expensive jacket was torn at the shoulder, his perfectly styled hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, and a thin line of blood trickled from a fresh scrape on his cheekbone where Marcus had pinned him against the concrete wall. Bryce's chest heaved with violent, ragged sobs as Marcus marched him directly toward the commanding officer at the center of the room. Marcus gave Bryce one final, effortless shove, sending him stumbling into the waiting grasp of two federal agents. As the agents grabbed Bryce's arms and slammed him down against a linen-draped cocktail table, the reality of the room seemed to shift, plunging into a surreal, agonizing slow motion. The camera lens of my own memory captured it perfectly, gliding smoothly past the chaos to record the total destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. In this suspended, elongated reality, the pulse of the police lights painted the ballroom in stark, flashing contrasts. I watched the heavy steel handcuffs bite into Bryce's wrists. The metallic click was sharp and definitive, echoing loudly in the cavernous space. Bryce squeezed his eyes shut, his face pressing against the scattered remnants of caviar and crystal glass on the table, finally surrendering to his own ruin. The camera of my mind kept panning, leaving Bryce behind and sweeping toward the center of the stage. Two agents, one man and one woman, stepped up onto the mahogany platform. They walked past the scattered, damning financial documents and moved directly toward Chloe. She was still kneeling in the glittering, pathetic puddle of her diamond-encrusted couture gown. As the agents loomed over her, the slow-motion bubbles shattered, snapping back to harsh, real-time reality. "I didn't do it," Chloe shrieked, her voice tearing at her throat. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, pushing herself away from the approaching agents until her back hit the base of the digital projection screen. She pointed a violently shaking finger toward the center of the room, where her husband was currently being read his Miranda rights. It was Bryce. "I didn't know anything about the money. I just spent it. I just wore the clothes. I don't know anything about offshore accounts." The female agent did not slow her pace. She reached down, grabbed Chloe by the upper arm with zero gentleness, and hauled her to her feet. "I am completely innocent," Chloe screamed, thrashing wildly against the agent grip. Her heavy diamond earrings slapped against her neck as she fought. "You have the wrong person. Ask him. Ask my husband." "Ma'am, stop resisting," the female agent ordered, her voice a flat, emotionless drone of authority. She easily overpowered my sister, twisting Chloe's arms behind her back. "We have the paper trail. Your signature is the authorizing authority on 7 different fraudulent LLCs. You are listed as the principal officer on the domestic holding companies used to funnel the stolen capital." "No," Chloe wailed, the word ripping out of her in a guttural sob as the cold steel cuffs snapped shut around her wrists. "He told me those were just tax documents. He said it was for the boutique. You can explain your corporate structuring strategies to the federal judge," the agent replied clinically, locking the cuffs and turning Chloe around to face the crowd. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit federal racketeering." The absolute crushing weight of her humiliation finally broke her. Chloe's knees buckled again, and the two agents had to physically support her weight by her armpits to keep her standing. She was dragged forward, her expensive heels dragging uselessly across the stage floor. I looked out into the crowd. The elite guests of the Vanguard Horizon Gala, the old money families, the rival matriarchs, the society bloggers were watching the spectacle with unfiltered predatory fascination. The royalty of Atlanta were being paraded through their own ballroom in handcuffs. The socialites did not look away out of respect. They leaned in closer. They held their phones higher, ensuring they captured every single tear streaming down Chloe's ruined face. They whispered viciously to one another, their eyes glittering with the thrill of witnessing such a catastrophic public execution. On the edge of the stage, Vivian realized the crowd was feasting on her destruction. The haughty, untouchable matriarch who had spent 40 years judging everyone else was now the main attraction of a high society freak show. She scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold onto her belongings. In a pathetic, desperate attempt to shield herself from the glaring camera flashes and the burning stares of her peers, she raised her white quilted Chanel clutch, pressing it flat against her face. She cowered behind the $10,000 handbag, as if the expensive leather could somehow protect her from federal indictment. Beside her, DeAndre remained slumped in his velvet chair, his eyes still glazed over, his mind completely broken by the sudden, absolute loss of his empire. He was a breathing corpse, entirely unresponsive to the chaos exploding around him. The lead FBI agent, a tall woman with sharp features and an immovable posture, walked up the stairs of the stage. She did not spare a glance for Chloe, who was currently being hauled down the center aisle. She stepped purposefully over the scattered, torn pages of the offshore ledgers and stopped directly in front of my parents. Vivian slowly lowered the Chanel clutch from her face, her heavily mascaraed eyes wide with a terror so profound it made her stop breathing. An agent approached Vivian and DeAndre. "Vivian and DeAndre Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and federal identity theft." The lead agent reached toward my mother, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. Vivian recoiled violently, letting out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her hands flew up defensively, but the agent was entirely unbothered by her resistance. He stepped in close, grabbing her right wrist with a practiced, immovable grip. The white quilted Chanel clutch slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the stage floor with a dull thud, spilling its expensive contents across the mahogany boards. A gold-plated lipstick tube rolled away, stopping against the toe of my black pump. The physical reality of the situation finally shattered the last remaining wall of Vivian's massive, fragile ego. As the agent wrenched her arms behind her back, the ratcheting sound of the metal cuffs locking into place echoed sharply. The flashing red and blue lights from the dozens of federal cruisers parked outside sliced through the tall ballroom windows. The violent alternating colors swept across the stage, casting long, dramatic shadows that seemed to orbit around us in a dizzying circle. The harsh strobe effect illuminated the absolute terror, distorting my mother's face. The haughty, untouchable armor she had worn like a second skin for 4 decades was completely gone, leaving behind nothing but a frantic, cornered woman facing the terrifying reality of federal prison. She twisted her neck, straining against the agent hold, and locked her wide, bloodshot eyes onto mine. Naomi. Vivian screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch that made the watching socialites flinch. Tell them it is a mistake. You have the power to stop this. You are the auditor. Tell them these files are wrong. Tell them you made an error. You cannot let them do this to me. You cannot let your own mother go to jail. Her desperation was entirely transparent. Even now, with her hands bound and her criminal empire exposed to the entire city, she was still trying to use me as her personal shield. She was still demanding that I clean up the mess she had created, invoking the title of mother as a weapon to extract my compliance. I stood completely still, letting the flashing police lights wash over us. I looked at the woman kneeling in front of me, flanked by federal agents, and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, no lingering sense of daughterly obligation. I remember a very specific Tuesday night last month. I said, my voice cutting through her hysterics with surgical precision. I remember coming home to find a heavy cardboard box sitting on my front porch. It was filled with forged routing numbers, falsified tax returns, and fake incorporation documents with my forged signature stamped on every single page. Vivian stopped struggling, her breath hitching in her throat as the memory caught up with her. You left me a voicemail that night. I continued, stepping closer so she was forced to crane her neck to look up at me. You told me that Chloe and Bryce had made a tiny mistake. You said that because I was a federal employee, the banks would not look too closely at the debt if I just claimed it was mine. You told me to take the fall. You actually said, and I quote, that I had nothing to lose anyway, because my life was already a disappointment, and that it was my duty to protect my sister country club standing. Naomi. I was desperate. Vivian pleaded, fresh tears carving dark tracks through her expensive foundation. I was trying to save our family. You have to understand the pressure I was under. We were going to lose the house. We were going to lose everything. You are my daughter. You are supposed to help us. You do not have a daughter, I replied, my tone dropping to a cold, clinical whisper. You have a scapegoat. And the scapegoat just locked the gate to the pen. You wanted me to take the heat for your felonies, Vivian. You wanted me to walk into a federal courtroom and surrender my entire future so you could keep hosting charity galas. You threw me to the wolves, but you forgot one critical detail. I am the one who feeds them. The agent holding her tightened his grip, pulling her roughly to her feet. Vivian's legs failed her, and she stumbled, sobbing uncontrollably as she was dragged away from me. She looked back over her shoulder, her face a twisted mask of desperation, but I simply turned my head, dismissing her from my reality entirely. To my left, the second agent had finally reached my father. DeAndre Sterling was still slumped in the velvet chair, his chest barely rising and falling. The agent grabbed him by the lapels of his custom tuxedo and hauled him upward. The violent physical motion finally snapped DeAndre out of his catatonic trance. He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting around the chaotic ballroom as if he had just woken up from a terrible nightmare, only to realize he was standing right in the middle of it. He looked down at his own wrist just as the agent snapped the handcuffs over his heavy gold Rolex. The metal bit into his skin. He stared at the cuffs in complete, uncomprehending horror. The man who had spent his life dictating the terms of every room he entered was now entirely powerless. He lifted his head, his gaze finding mine across the stage. The arrogant, ruthless patriarch was gone. He looked incredibly old, his shoulders hunched, his face sagging with the weight of total ruin. The high society peers he had spent his life trying to impress were currently holding up their smartphones, capturing the exact moment the great DeAndre Sterling was led away in disgrace. Naomi, he rasped, his voice trembling and weak. His eyes begged me for a lifeline that did not exist. Naomi, please. Our legacy. I looked at him, taking in the full, pathetic picture of the man who had always viewed me as a useless line item on a spreadsheet. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. This is your legacy, Dad. I said, the finality of the words ringing clear over the wail of the sirens outside. Enjoy it. The federal agent yanked DeAndre upward by the collar of his ruined tuxedo, dragging him away from the stage. My father did not utter another word. The remaining fight had bled out of him, leaving nothing but a hollow, staggering shell of a man who suddenly realized that his entire universe had been a beautifully decorated lie. He shuffled forward, his head bowed, his expensive shoes scuffing against the marble floor as he was led into the chaotic sea of navy blue windbreakers and flashing tactical lights. As his figure retreated, the world around me began to shift. The deafening cacophony of the ballroom, the shouting agents, the weeping socialites, the relentless blare of the sirens outside began to fade, dropping into a muffled, distant hum. The frantic, terrified movements of my family turned into a soft, indistinct blur of color and motion. The shallow depth of field isolated me completely from the wreckage. I stood in the center of the stage, breathing in the cool, conditioned air of the country club. I felt an absolute, profound serenity wash over my entire body. My heart was not racing. My hands were perfectly steady. The crushing, suffocating weight of being the Sterling family scapegoat, the heavy, invisible chains of guilt, expectation, and constant belittlement had simply evaporated. I looked straight ahead, my face a portrait of complete tranquility. I was finally irrevocably free. Through the soft focus of the background, I watched the blurry silhouette of Chloe being frog-marched toward the grand exit. Her massive diamond-encrusted gown snagged on the corner of a cocktail table, ripping the delicate silk, but the agents did not stop to let her fix it. She was practically dragged out of the room, her high-pitched wails of panic dissolving into the general uproar. Bryce was already gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the service corridor and the waiting federal transport vans. But it was Vivian who provided the grand finale. The audio snapped back into sharp, violent focus as my mother released a scream so raw and unhinged it sounded inhuman. The two agents holding her arms were forced to physically lift her off the floor as her legs gave out completely. The woman who had dedicated her entire existence to cultivating an image of flawless, untouchable grace was currently throwing a massive, hysterical tantrum in front of the entire Atlanta elite. Vivian kicked wildly, her expensive designer heels flying off and clattering against the marble floor. Her perfectly pinned updo had collapsed, sending strands of hair clinging to her tear-soaked face. Black streaks of mascara ran down her cheeks, ruining her pristine, surgically enhanced features. She was sobbing so violently she could barely draw breath, fighting against the iron grip of the agents with the frantic, useless energy of a trapped animal. I stepped down from the stage, my movements unhurried and calm, and followed the procession as they dragged her out of the ballroom. The path through the grand lobby of the Vanguard Horizon Club was a gauntlet of pure, unadulterated humiliation. The very people Vivian had spent decades trying to impress, the rival matriarchs. The old money investors, the society bloggers were lined up on either side of the velvet ropes, watching her destruction with morbid fascination. Nobody looked away. Nobody offered a word of comfort. Dozens of smartphones were held high in the air, recording every single second of Vivian Sterling's ugly, undignified downfall. "Help me!" Vivian shrieked, twisting her neck to look at a group of women she had lunched with just yesterday. "Call a lawyer. Do something. Do not just stand there." The women physically recoiled, stepping back as if Vivian were highly contagious. They pulled their fur wraps tighter around their shoulders, their faces twisted in expressions of supreme disgust. They were already distancing themselves, calculating how quickly they could erase the Sterling name from their charity boards and country club rosters. Vivian realized in that agonizing moment that her social capital, the only currency she truly valued, was entirely bankrupt. The heavy glass doors of the clubhouse slid open, revealing the muggy Atlanta night air and a massive fleet of federal cruisers blocking the valet circle. The strobing red and blue lights illuminated the sweeping driveway, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across Vivian's ruined face. The agents hauled her down the front steps, moving her forcefully toward the open back door of a waiting squad car. She fought them at the door, planting her bare feet against the asphalt and refusing to get inside. She twisted around her chest, heaving her eyes wild and bloodshot as she scanned the crowd spilling out of the clubhouse. Her frantic gaze finally locked onto me. I was standing at the top of the steps, bathed in the flashing police lights, looking down at her with absolute unwavering calm. "Naomi," Vivian wailed, her voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate sob. She lunged against the cuffs, trying to pull away from the car. "Please, you cannot let them do this. I am your mother. You have to fix this. Tell them it is a lie." I walked slowly down the concrete steps, the sound of my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The federal agents parted slightly, allowing me to step right up to the edge of the squad car. Vivian looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, desperate hope. She actually believed even now that the ingrained conditioning of my childhood would kick in. She thought I would shield her. She thought I would step in front of the bullet just like she had demanded I do when she left that box of forged documents on my porch. I looked at the woman who had tried to sacrifice my freedom to save her country club membership. I leaned in close, bringing my face just inches from hers. The chaotic noise of the police radios and the shouting crowd seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of us in the harsh glare of the flashing lights. "Do not make a scene." "Mom," I whispered, my voice perfectly smooth, echoing the exact dismissive instructions she had given me my entire life. "Just sign the confession papers and maybe I will think about posting your bail." The remaining color drained completely from Vivian's face. The last fragile thread of her sanity snapped. She let out a long, agonizing wail of pure despair. The sound was immediately cut off as the lead agent placed a heavy hand on top of her head, shoving her forcefully into the back of the squad car. The heavy door slammed shut with a definitive metallic thud. I stood on the asphalt, my posture perfectly straight, and watched through the reinforced glass as my mother continued to sob hysterically in the back seat. The cruiser shifted into gear, its tires rolling over the manicured gravel of the driveway as it pulled away, carrying the ruins of the Sterling Empire into the dark. The flashing red and blue lights vanished into the distance, taking the toxic weight of my past with them. The cold night air of Atlanta gave way to a brilliant golden morning. The memory of that chaotic driveway fades, replaced by the soft, steady sunlight pouring through the sheer linen curtains of my own living room. The space is bathed in warmth. There are no frantic phone calls, no passive-aggressive demands, and no heavy cardboard boxes filled with forged documents waiting on my porch. There is only the quiet, steady rhythm of a life built on absolute truth. I take a deep breath, letting the pristine stillness of the morning settle into my bones, and I look directly at you. It has been exactly 1 year since the Vanguard Horizon Gala, a full trip around the sun since the Sterling family house of cards collapsed in front of the entire city. People often ask me if the aftermath was difficult, if tearing down my own blood relatives left me with any regrets. I always give them the exact same answer. The only regret I have is that I did not do it sooner. The federal justice system moves with a brutal, methodical efficiency when handed a perfectly organized 60-page dossier of irrefutable evidence. Bryce Davenport learned that lesson the hard way. The arrogant architect who thought he could manipulate offshore accounts and leverage my identity to fund his fraudulent empire was stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his towering ego. He tried to negotiate. He tried to leverage deals and throw his accomplices under the bus, but the prosecutors had zero use for a man who had already been handed to them tied up in a neat, undeniable bow. Bryce pleaded guilty to a mountain of charges, including wire fraud and racketeering. He is currently serving a 15-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary. The man who once believed he was the smartest person in every room now spends his days adhering to a rigid, unforgiving schedule dictated by prison guards. There are no corner offices or champagne toasts where he is going. My sister Chloe avoided a prison cell, but her current reality might actually be a worse punishment for someone completely addicted to high society status. The federal judge showed no mercy when it came to restitution. Chloe was ordered to repay every single stolen dollar funneled through the boutique LLCs bearing her name. Her diamond earrings, her couture gowns, her imported sports cars, everything was seized and auctioned off by the government. Today, the former crown princess of Atlanta society works a minimum wage retail job at a discount department store in the suburbs. She spends 40 hours a week folding denim and taking orders from teenage shift managers. She occasionally has to ring up customers who used to attend her lavish dinner parties. She has to smile, hand them their receipts, and watch them walk away with the life she threw away for greed. As for Vivian and DeAndre Sterling, the mighty patriarch and matriarch who demanded absolute perfection from everyone around them, their kingdom was utterly dismantled. The government froze their assets entirely. The sprawling mansion with the marble foyer was repossessed. The country club memberships were instantly revoked. Their names became a toxic punchline in the very social circles they used to dominate. They managed to avoid serving time behind bars due to plea deals and cooperating testimonies, but they did not escape their punishment. They are currently under strict federal house arrest. They live together in a cramped two-bedroom rented apartment with thin walls and cheap linoleum floors. They wear ankle monitors that track their every movement. Vivian no longer hosts charity galas. DeAndre no longer barks orders at terrified executives. They sit in that tiny apartment day after day, surrounded by nothing but each other and the deafening silence of their former friends who lost their phone numbers the moment the indictments were unsealed. While they were busy paying for their crimes, I was busy reaping the rewards of my integrity. The federal investigators publicly cleared my name within weeks of the arrests, explicitly noting that my whistleblowing had unraveled the entire operation. My firm did not just stand by me. They rewarded my meticulous auditing skills and absolute refusal to compromise my ethics. Last month, I was officially promoted to director. I have the corner office now. I manage a team of 20 brilliant analysts. I am respected, valued, and completely secure in my career. I built my success block by block without cutting a single corner or stepping on a single neck. But the greatest reward is not the title or the corner office. The greatest reward is the peace I feel right now standing in this sunlit living room. Marcus and I built this sanctuary together. It is a home entirely devoid of manipulation, hidden agendas, and toxic familial ties. We are safe here, and we are growing. I rest my hand gently against the slight swell of my stomach. Marcus and I are expecting our first child this spring. We are already preparing the nursery down the hall. I know exactly what kind of mother I am going to be. I am going to raise a child who knows that love is never conditional. A child who knows that their worth is not determined by their ability to uphold a fake family image. We are starting a new legacy, one built on a foundation of genuine love and unwavering truth. People will tell you that blood is thicker than water. They will look you in the eye and tell you that you have to endure abuse, manipulation, and disrespect simply because those people are your family. They will demand that you keep the peace at the expense of your own sanity. But let me tell you a secret. Toxic blood will poison your well. You do not owe your loyalty to people who view you as an instrument for their own selfish gain. The day I stopped trying to save people who were actively drowning me was the day I truly started living. I stopped accepting the role of the scapegoat. I stopped shrinking myself to fit into their fraudulent narrative. I took control of the pen, and I wrote my own ending. I did not just survive the fire they set for me. I became the inferno. The soft sound of footsteps approaches from the hallway. Marcus steps into the living room, his presence instantly radiating a quiet, unshakable comfort. He holds two steaming ceramic mugs. He walks up to me, his eyes full of a deep, abiding warmth, and hands me a cup of tea. He leans down, pressing a tender, lingering kiss to my forehead. I lean into his embrace, wrapping both hands around the warm mug, my heart completely full. The morning light catches the steam rising from the tea as the camera slowly pulls back, drifting away until the bright, peaceful room gently fades into absolute quiet black.